Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we embark on a rather peculiar journey, venturing into the very heart of history, a place where even the most stoic figures eventually come to rest. We're talking, of course, about the final, rather cramped, quarters of one of England's most monumental monarchs, Henry VIII. Imagine, if you will, the sheer weight of expectation, the immense machinery of state, the cloying scent of mortality, all converging on a single, ponderous box. This isn't just about a wooden casket, it's a story of power, decay, and the surprisingly persistent whispers that echo from the grave. They probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from afar, why not drop your location and the local time in the comments? It's always fascinating to see where our sleepy little history club reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The winter air of 1547 bites with a particular chill, a fitting shroud for the enormity of the occasion. King Henry VIII, that colossus of a man, both in ambition and later, unfortunately, in girth, has breathed his last. His death, a slow, agonising slide into the inevitable, had been anticipated by many, though few dared speak of it openly. Now, however, the grim reality sets in. The royal palace of Whitehall, typically a hive of vibrant courtly life, is cloaked in a suffocating hush, punctuated only by the hushed movements of anxious courtiers and the low murmur of prayers. This isn't just the passing of a king, it's the end of an era, a seismic shift in the very bedrock of English power. The immediate aftermath of a monarch's demise is a delicate dance of protocol and panic. For Henry, a king whose reign was defined by his imposing will and a rather dramatic flair for succession planning, his final journey would be no less theatrical. The sheer logistical challenge of preparing such a substantial monarch for his eternal slumber was, to put it mildly, an Herculean task. His body, bloated and afflicted by various ailments, including a rather nasty leg ulcer that had plagued him for years, required immediate attention. This wasn't a quick trip to the funeral home. This was an elaborate, highly ritualized process designed to both preserve the king's remains and reinforce the divine nature of his rule, even in death. The chosen destination for his eternal repose was St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, a place steeped in royal history and tradition. It was here, within the hallowed walls, that Henry had planned to lie alongside his beloved, though ultimately fleeting, third wife, Jane Seymour. The journey itself, from Whitehall to Windsor, would be a spectacle, a final grand parade for the fallen lion. But first, the king had to be made ready. The creation of the coffin itself was a masterclass in Tudor craftsmanship, albeit with a macabre purpose. It wasn't just a simple wooden box, it was a complex structure, designed to withstand the rigours of travel and the passage of time, or so they hoped. Imagine the carpenters, working with grim determination, selecting the finest oak, meticulously joining the planks, their hammers echoing softly in the otherwise silent workshops. This was no ordinary coffin, it was a royal vessel built to house the earthly remains of a king who had reshaped a nation. Historians still argue whether the coffin was lined with lead immediately, or if that was a later addition to contain the inevitable decay. The historical records are somewhat ambiguous on the exact sequence, leaving room for scholarly debate and plenty of whispered theories. The chosen design, while grand, also needed to be practical. It had to be robust enough to carry the immense weight of the king's embalmed body, as well as the various accoutrements that would accompany him. The sheer scale of the undertaking is almost comical in its somberness. We're talking about a man who, in his later years, reportedly weighed over 28 stone, or around 390 pounds, and had a waistline of 54 inches. Getting that into any coffin would require some serious engineering. One can almost picture the poor carpenters scratching their heads, muttering, "Right, so, how wide exactly is His Majesty on a good day?" A morbid laugh, perhaps, but a laugh nonetheless to lighten the oppressive weight of the moment. Once constructed, the coffin itself would be decorated, probably draped in rich velvet, adorned with gilded emblems and the royal coat of arms. It wasn't just a container, it was a symbol, a final, tangible representation of the king's enduring power. The journey to Windsor would not be a swift one. Tudor roads were notoriously bumpy, little more than glorified dirt tracks in many places, and the sheer bulk of the coffin, likely requiring a team of horses to pull it, would necessitate a slow and stately progression. The weather too would play its part. A cold, damp February can make any journey miserable, let alone one burdened with such a solemn cargo. The procession itself would be a grand, theatrical affair, designed to impress upon the populace the continued legitimacy of the monarchy, even in transition. It would be led by heralds, proclaiming the king's death, followed by solemn clergy, mournful noblemen, and the household guard, all moving with a synchronized, almost robotic precision. The coffin, likely placed on a specially constructed bier or carriage, would be the focal point, a stark reminder of the impermanence of even the most formidable power. Imagine the hushed crowds lining the route, their breath pluming in the cold air, a mix of genuine grief, morbid curiosity, and perhaps a touch of relief. After all, Henry's reign, while transformative, was also marked by a certain unpredictability. The route itself would have been meticulously planned, likely avoiding any particularly rough patches or populated areas that might cause a disturbance. It was a careful balance between public display and dignified discretion. The journey itself would take several days, with planned stops at various manor houses or churches along the way where the coffin could rest overnight. These interim resting places would have been transformed into temporary chapels of rest, with candles burning brightly and vigils kept throughout the night. It was a strange, almost theatrical road trip, with the most important passenger being utterly oblivious to the scenery. The sheer logistics involved in moving such a heavy and precious cargo across the Tudor landscape would have been immense. Roads would have needed to be cleared, bridges inspected for structural integrity, and fresh teams of horses arranged at regular intervals. This wasn't just a simple drive, it was a strategic military operation, designed to ensure the safe and dignified passage of the king's remains. There's a wonderful, almost farcical image that springs to mind, a Tudor equivalent of a roadside assistance team, ready to spring into action if a wheel broke or a horse simply decided enough was enough. Though, in this case, the stakes would have been considerably higher than a flat tire. Upon arrival at Windsor, the final leg of the journey, the solemnity would reach its crescendo. The gates of the castle, which had seen so much life, so much intrigue, would open to receive their deceased sovereign. The scene would be one of profound reverence, with the entire castle staff, from the lowest scullery maid to the highest-ranking noble, gathered to witness this historic moment. The great bell of the chapel would toll, its mournful sound echoing across the frosty grounds, a final resounding farewell to the king who had, in so many ways, shaped the very identity of England. The passage of the coffin into the chapel itself would be a slow, deliberate manoeuvre. The doors, usually flung open to welcome the living, would now receive the lifeless form of their king. It's a moment pregnant with symbolism, the transfer of power from the temporal to the eternal. The vast, vaulted interior of St. George's Chapel, usually filled with the sounds of prayer and worship, would be hushed, awaiting its new permanent resident. The air, already heavy with the scent of old stone and incense, would now be tinged with the unmistakable aroma of mortality, a subtle yet pervasive presence that would linger for centuries. The coffin, a silent, imposing presence, would finally be at rest, or so everyone thought. The moment the coffin, bearing the immense and inert form of Henry VIII, finally rested within the hallowed, if somewhat chilly confines of Whitehall Palace, a new phase of the macabre preparations began, the embalming. This wasn't merely a practical necessity to preserve the body for the arduous journey to Windsor and the subsequent lying in state. It was a deeply ritualized, almost alchemical process, steeped in medieval medical practice and a fervent belief in the sanctity of the royal body. Imagine, if you will, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on the solemn faces of the physicians, surgeons and apothecaries, all arrayed around the imposing presence of the deceased king. The air, thick with the scent of spices, unguents and something far less pleasant, would have been oppressive. The Tudor understanding of anatomy and preservation, while rudimentary by modern standards, was nevertheless meticulously applied. Their goal was not perfect preservation in the forensic sense, but rather to delay the inevitable decay long enough for the necessary funeral rites, and the public display to take place without undue unpleasantness. This was a king, after all, and even in death his dignity, or at least the illusion of it, had to be maintained. The process typically began with the evisceration. This was, to put it mildly, not for the faint of heart. The internal organs, the heart, lungs, liver and intestines, were carefully removed. These vital parts, once the very engine of the king's formidable will, would then be separately treated. Often they were washed, sometimes in wine or spirits, and then placed in a special mixture of spices and aromatic herbs. Frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, and even rarer, more exotic spices like aloes and cassia would have been employed not just for their scent, but for their supposed preservative qualities. This concoction was then sealed within a separate leaden casket, often referred to as a heart urn or viscera casket. This smaller, grim container would then be interred separately, usually beneath the altar or in a designated spot within the chapel, symbolising a division of the sacred and the earthly. Historians still argue whether the removal of the heart had a specific theological meaning beyond practical preservation, or if it was simply part of the standard embalming protocol for monarchs of the era. This ambiguity offers a tantalising glimpse into the intertwining of belief and practicality in Tudor times. Next came the cleaning and packing of the body cavity. After the removal of the organs, the cavity itself would be thoroughly cleaned. This involved washing with strong spirits, often alcohol, and then packing it tightly with more aromatic substances. Sawdust, often infused with liberal quantities of spices, would be a common filler, designed to absorb any remaining fluids and to impart a more pleasing aroma. Sometimes, even more exotic and expensive materials like cotton steeped in embalming oils would be used, depending on the status of the deceased and the resources available. It was a rather gruesome form of interior decoration, designed to delay the inevitable processes of nature. One can only imagine the apprentices, perhaps fresh-faced and wide-eyed, trying desperately not to gag amidst the fumes and the grim reality of their task. "Just breathe through your mouth, lad," an older, jaded assistant might mutter, "and remember, it's for the king." The external treatment of the body was equally meticulous. The king's considerable bulk, particularly in his later years, would have presented unique challenges. His limbs would be massaged and straightened, his face carefully composed to present a semblance of peaceful repose. The skin, likely discoloured and marked by illness, would be washed and then anointed with various oils and unguents. These were not just for scent, some believed they had antiseptic qualities. The orifices of the body were often plugged or sealed with wax or pitch to prevent the escape of fluids. This was less about aesthetics and more about containing the inevitable processes of decomposition, especially given the public display that was to follow. The entire process could take many hours, perhaps even days, given the scale of Henry's body and the meticulous attention to detail required. The embalmers, usually skilled surgeons or apothecaries who specialised in such morbid arts, would work in shifts, their movements precise and practised. They understood the delicate balance between reverence and the stark reality of the task at hand. It was a trade passed down through generations, a grim, necessary skill for dealing with the passing of the powerful. One quirky tidbit from the period is the use of what was sometimes called embalming apples, or spiced bundles, which were placed inside the body cavity. These were essentially pomanders, small bags or spheres filled with highly aromatic substances, sometimes even dried fruits and flowers, all heavily spiced. The idea was to fill the cavity with a pleasant scent that would mask the odours of decay for as long as possible. It's almost a rather sweet, if macabre, detail, imagining a Tudor king filled with what amounts to potpourri. After the embalming, the body would be wrapped. Often, layers of waxed linen or cerecloth, cloth impregnated with wax or other preserving agents, were used. This provided an additional barrier against the elements and helped to maintain the body's form. The wrapping would have been tightly bound, almost mummifying the king's form, ensuring that he remained as intact as possible for the journey ahead. It's here that the line between preservation and transformation begins to blur. The king's earthly vessel was becoming something else entirely, a monument to itself. Once wrapped, the body would then be dressed. This wasn't a casual dressing. The king would be attired in his finest robes of state, rich velvet and ermine, symbols of his regal power. A crown, sometimes a real one, sometimes a gilded effigy, would be placed on his head. A sceptre and orb would be positioned in his hands, cementing his image as the eternal monarch. This was the moment the king transformed from a decaying corpse into a stately effigy, ready for public veneration. The illusion was paramount. The coffin itself would likely have been lined with lead. This was a crucial step for long-term preservation and containment. Lead, being malleable and relatively airtight, would help to seal the body from the outside air, thus slowing decomposition. It also provided a sturdy, impervious barrier for any fluids that might inevitably seep from the body. The lead lining would have been hammered and soldered into place, forming a snug, custom-fit inner shell. The weight of this lead lining, added to the already immense weight of the king's body and the solid oak coffin, would make the entire ensemble incredibly heavy. Getting this leviathan of a coffin from the palace embalming chamber to the waiting carriage would have been a significant feat of brute strength and coordinated effort. One can almost hear the grunts and groans of the porters, muscles straining, as they carefully manoeuvred the weighty box. Mind your back, lads, this ain't no ordinary luggage. The air in the embalming chamber would have been a potent mix of solemnity and the rather pungent reality of the task. The faint scent of death, despite all the spices, would still linger, a constant reminder of the king's mortality. It was a sobering experience for all involved, a direct confrontation with the fragility of life, even for the most powerful man in the kingdom. The work, however, was done with a professional detachment, a focus on the task at hand, knowing that the eyes of the court, and indeed the entire kingdom, were metaphorically upon them. The embalmed body, now encased in its lead-lined oak coffin, would then be sealed. This sealing was perhaps the most definitive act, signifying the final closure on the king's earthly presence. The lid would be fastened with heavy iron bands and secured with sturdy nails, driven home with finality. This wasn't a casket designed for viewing, it was a sarcophagus, a permanent vault for a permanent departure. The outer coffin might then be further adorned with more decorative elements, perhaps velvet pall coverings, and the royal escutcheon proudly displayed. This meticulous preparation, though gruesome, was essential for the subsequent stages of Henry's funeral. Without it, the lying in state and where the effigy, or in some cases the actual body, was put on public display, would have been a far less dignified affair. The embalming, therefore, was not merely about preserving a body, it was about preserving an image, maintaining the aura of majesty even in death. It was a performance, a final, chilling act in the grand drama of a king's life. The entire process underscores the Tudor obsession with status, even in the afterlife. Every detail, from the choice of spices to the method of sealing the coffin, was imbued with meaning and symbolic weight. It was a testament to the belief that a king, even when dead, remained a king, and his final journey should reflect his unwavering authority. This was Henry VIII's final command, a silent decree from beyond the grave that his passing would be as grand and as controlled as his life. The coffin, now a sealed, heavy monolith, was ready for its next, even more public role. With the grisly work of embalming complete, and the imposing coffin now sealed shut, Henry VIII was ready for his final public performance, the lying in state. This wasn't merely a private viewing for grieving relatives, it was a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to impress upon the kingdom the gravity of the royal demise and, crucially, to smooth the transition of power. The atmosphere at Whitehall Palace, already sombre, deepened into one of theatrical mourning, every detail meticulously controlled. The setting for this morbid display was typically a grand chamber, often the presence chamber, transformed into a chapel of rest. Draped entirely in black velvet from ceiling to floor, the room absorbed all light and sound, creating an almost suffocating aura of solemnity. Candles, hundreds of them, flickered and guttered, casting dancing shadows that lent an eerie, otherworldly glow to the scene. The air, despite all the embalming spices, still carried a faint, sweet, sickly scent of decay, mingling with beeswax and incense. This was Tudor aromatherapy at its most poignant. At the heart of this gloomy tableau lay the coffin, now an even more imposing presence, resting on a grand, elevated catafalque. This was not a simple stand. It was a multi-tiered structure, also draped in black, often adorned with silver or gilt ornaments, representing the king's heraldic achievements and lineage. It elevated the coffin, making it the undeniable focal point, a silent, powerful statement of royal authority, even in absence. The weight of it all, both literal and metaphorical, was immense. Upon the coffin, or more often beside it, rested the meticulously crafted effigy of King Henry VIII. This wasn't the king's actual body, but a lifelike, or perhaps as lifelike as Tudor art allowed, representation of him, dressed in his royal robes, complete with a crown, sceptre, and orb. This effigy was crucial. Given the limitations of embalming and the potential for a king's body to deteriorate, especially over several days of public viewing, the effigy served as a dignified proxy. It allowed the public and foreign dignitaries to pay their respects without confronting the grim reality of a decaying corpse. One can almost hear a modern-day observer whispering, "Ah, the original Madame Tussauds, but with significantly higher stakes." The effigy was often remarkably detailed, crafted from wax or wood, and sometimes even incorporating real hair. The artists and sculptors tasked with this grim duty would strive for a likeness, attempting to capture the king in his prime, or at least in a more idealised form than his final ailing state. Imagine the artisans poring over portraits, trying to recreate the formidable gaze, the powerful jawline, perhaps even a hint of the ginger beard that was so characteristic of Henry. This was less a portrait of death, and more a carefully curated image of eternal power and majesty. It was the original photoshopped image, long before computers existed, designed to maintain an illusion. Surrounding the catafalque and effigy were the symbols of Henry's reign. The royal standard, emblazoned with the Tudor rose and the arms of England and France, hung heavily, its rich fabric absorbing the dim light. The Garter King of Arms, a figure of immense ceremonial authority, would be present, along with other heralds, all in their elaborate tabards standing as silent sentinels. Clergy, draped in black vestments, would continuously chant prayers for the repose of the king's soul, their low voices creating a droning, almost hypnotic background sound. The lying in state was a highly controlled environment. Access would have been restricted, with only certain individuals permitted to enter the chamber to pay their respects. High-ranking nobles, foreign ambassadors, and members of the Privy Council would file past, their faces a carefully composed mask of grief and deference. They would bow or curtsy deeply, perhaps offer a brief prayer, and then silently depart, the heavy velvet drapes muffling their footsteps. This was not a moment for emotional outbursts. It was a time for solemn duty and political manoeuvring, even in the shadow of death. Historians still argue whether the common people had any access to view the effigy, or if it was strictly reserved for the elite. The records are often vague on the exact social stratification of funeral attendants, leaving open the possibility of limited public viewing or just official representation. The purpose of this elaborate display was multifaceted. Firstly, it allowed a period for national mourning, a collective acknowledgement of the king's passing. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it served to affirm the continuity of the monarchy. By showcasing the royal emblems and the effigy, it reminded everyone that the crown, though momentarily without its wearer, was not without its power. The king was dead. Long live the king. This transition, particularly with the young Edward VI now on the throne, was critical for stability. The logistics of maintaining such a display for several days would have been considerable. The candles would need constant attention, trimmed and replaced to maintain their mournful glow. The air, despite all efforts, would grow stale and heavy. Guards would stand vigil day and night, ensuring no unauthorized access or disruption. It was an exercise in endurance for those involved, a silent testament to their unwavering loyalty, or perhaps simply their job security. Imagine trying to stay awake and alert for hours on end, surrounded by the oppressive silence, broken only by whispers and the scent of death. It sounds less like a royal duty and more like a particularly unpleasant shift in a haunted house. Beyond the immediate purpose, the lying in state also reinforced the theological beliefs of the time. The prayers and ceremonies were intended to aid the king's soul in its journey to the afterlife. It was a time for repentance, for seeking divine mercy, and for affirming the spiritual authority of the Church, even in a nation that Henry himself had dramatically reshaped. The very act of standing vigil was a devotional one, a way for the living to intercede for the departed. The sheer scale of the event also reflected Henry's larger-than-life persona. Even in death, he demanded attention. His funeral arrangements, starting with the embalming and continuing through the lying in state, were designed to be grand, expensive, and unforgettable. This was a king who spent lavishly on everything, from palaces to wars to wives, and his final exit was no exception. The cost alone would have been astronomical, a fitting send-off for a monarch who, even accidentally, bankrupt his subjects with remarkable frequency. The silent presence of the effigy, a hollow shell of the man who once bellowed commands and wielded absolute power, must have been a chilling sight. For those who had known Henry personally, perhaps even feared him, it offered a strange mix of relief and melancholy. The man who had reshaped the English church, executed wives and ministers, and projected an image of invincible power, was now reduced to a waxen likeness lying still and silent. It was a potent reminder of the ultimate equalizer, death. The days of the lying in state would drag on, each hour marked by the slow consumption of candle wax and the quiet prayers of those in attendance. Outside the chamber, the palace would still buzz with activity, albeit subdued. Preparations for the funeral procession to Windsor would be underway, and the new king, Edward VI, along with his regents, would be navigating the tricky waters of succession. The lying in state, therefore, served as a temporary pause, a moment for the nation to collectively hold its breath before the inevitable onward march of history. When the time finally came to remove the coffin from the chamber, it would be a solemn and difficult task. The heavy oak and lead box, possibly weighing several £100, would require a team of strong bearers. Each movement would be slow and deliberate, designed to maintain the dignity of the king's final journey. The effigy, which had served its purpose, might be carefully removed and stored, or it might accompany the coffin on its journey to Windsor. This detail often varied with royal funerals, adding another layer of historical nuance. The closing of the chamber, the snuffing of the candles, and the drawing of the drapes would mark the end of this particular chapter. The temporary chapel of rest would be dismantled, the black hangings removed, and the grand chamber would slowly revert to its original function, though forever imbued with the memory of the king's silent vigil. The air, however, would likely retain a faint, lingering scent, a ghostly reminder of the powerful presence that had once filled the space, both in life and in the dignified, if chilling, display of his death. The next step awaited, a solemn and impressive procession towards Windsor, a final earthly journey for a king who had shaped an entire age. The lying in state, a solemn tableau of black velvet and flickering candlelight, eventually drew to a close, with the last of the dignitaries having filed past the imposing effigy, and the final prayers whispered. It was time for Henry VIII to embark on his most significant and in many ways his final public journey, the procession from Whitehall Palace to Windsor Castle. This wasn't merely a transfer of a deceased body. It was a grand, theatrical performance on a national stage, meticulously planned to reinforce the continuity of power and the majesty of the Tudor monarchy, even in death. Imagine the crisp, cold air of early February 1547, biting at the faces of the assembled crowds. The atmosphere, though sombre, was also charged with a peculiar mix of anticipation and awe. Thousands would have lined the route, stretching for miles, eager to catch a glimpse of this momentous procession. For many, it would be the closest they ever came to the man who had so profoundly shaped their lives. The roads, likely little more than muddy tracks in places, would have been specially prepared, smoothed and cleared as much as possible, to ensure the dignified passage of the enormous cavalcade. At the head of the procession marched the heralds, their colourful tabards emblazoned with the royal arms, a stark contrast to the sombre black and purple that dominated the rest of the cortege. They were the announcers, the official proclaimers of the king's death, their voices ringing out the mournful news, ensuring no one along the route was unaware of the gravity of the occasion. Following them would be various dignitaries, representatives of the church and members of the Privy Council, all on horseback, their expressions carefully composed. Their presence underscored the official nature of the event, a gathering of the kingdom's elite to honour their departed sovereign. Then came the heart of the procession, the coffin itself. This colossal receptacle, laden with the embalmed king and its lead lining, was an incredible weight. It rested upon a magnificently adorned funeral car or hearse, a specially constructed wagon that was a work of art in itself. This hearse would have been draped in the richest black velvet, embroidered with gold and silver thread, and adorned with numerous candles, often housed in elaborate silver sconces, adding to the mournful glow even in daylight. Pulled by a team of black-draped horses, their heads bowed, their harnesses jingling softly, the funeral car moved at a painfully slow, deliberate pace. This was not a quick dash. It was a measured, stately progress, allowing the populace ample time to observe and absorb the solemnity of the moment. One could easily imagine a cheeky stable boy, perhaps a touch too familiar with the horses, whispering, "Easy, old boy, don't want to jostle his majesty now, do we? He's a bit on the heavy side." Upon the funeral car, or sometimes carried just in front of it, was the effigy of King Henry. This lifelike representation, dressed in his royal regalia, served as the visual focal point, a powerful substitute for the absent king. It allowed the crowds to see a semblance of their monarch, complete with crown, sceptre and orb, reinforcing the continuity of the monarchy. This was Tudor media management at its finest, a carefully curated image for public consumption. The effigy would have been secured to prevent any undignified movement during the journey, ensuring it maintained its regal posture. The air would have been filled with a medley of sounds: the slow, rhythmic tramp of thousands of feet, the muffled clopping of horses' hooves, the creak of the funeral car's wheels, and the continuous low drone of prayers chanted by accompanying clergy. Incense would have been burned, its sweet, heavy smoke mingling with the chill winter air, creating a sensory experience designed to evoke reverence and sorrow. Bells in every town and village along the route would have tolled mournfully, adding to the melancholic symphony. The procession was not just a straight march. It was punctuated by stops, planned meticulously in advance. At various points along the roughly 20-mile journey, often at significant churches or noble estates, the coffin would be brought inside for a brief vigil. These temporary chapels of rest would be hastily prepared, draped in black and lit by candles, allowing a fresh wave of prayers and respects to be paid. These stops also served practical purposes, allowing the horses to rest and the vast retinue to refresh themselves, even if the primary passenger remained stubbornly inert. Such pauses were essential for maintaining the dignity and order of such a monumental undertaking. The sheer scale of the retinue accompanying the king was staggering. It wasn't just a few mourners, it was a moving city of courtiers, guards, clergy and servants, all dressed in black mourning attire. The sumptuary laws of the time dictated who could wear what, but for a royal funeral, mourning cloth was provided for thousands. The visual impact of this massive, sombre procession, slowly winding its way through the English countryside, would have been immense, a powerful demonstration of the reach and resources of the crown. Historians still debate the exact number of participants, but estimates often run into the thousands, making it one of the largest funeral processions in English history. As the procession approached Windsor, the sense of occasion would have intensified. Windsor Castle, a bastion of royal power for centuries, stood sentinel, its ancient stones absorbing the weight of this final royal arrival. The town of Windsor would have been completely transformed, its streets lined with people, every window filled with onlookers. The castle gates, usually bustling with everyday life, would now be open wide, awaiting the arrival of their dead king. The entry into the castle grounds and then into the lower ward leading to St. George's Chapel would have been the most visually impressive segment. The final stretch to the chapel itself would be particularly slow and deliberate, with the funeral car entering the sacred confines under the watchful gaze of hundreds. The great bell of St. George's Chapel would have begun its deep, mournful toll, a sound that carried across the wintry landscape, announcing the imminent arrival of the king to his eternal resting place. It's a sound that seems to echo through time, a heavy, sombre punctuation mark on a powerful life. The approach to the chapel doors, those grand wooden portals that had witnessed so many royal baptisms, weddings and coronations, now opened to receive a lifeless sovereign. The interior of the chapel, already prepared and draped in black, would have been thick with incense and the hushed whispers of anticipation. The sheer scale of the coffin, combined with the narrowness of some of the chapel's internal passages, would have required extreme care in its final manoeuvres. One can almost picture the concerned glances between the bearers, a silent prayer that no mishap would occur at this most crucial juncture. Just a few more feet, lads, just a few more feet, as the coffin, with its precious, if somewhat putrid cargo, finally moved through the nave towards the designated burial vault. The atmosphere would have been electric with a kind of reverent tension. The light from the stained glass windows, muted by the winter sky, would have fallen on the sombre procession, creating an almost painterly scene of grief and grandeur. The slow, rhythmic chants of the clergy would fill the space, echoing off the vaulted ceiling accompanying the king on his final approach to the tomb. The arrival at Windsor was not just the end of a physical journey, it was the symbolic completion of Henry's earthly reign. From this moment on, he would exist only in memory, in record, and in the silent confines of his tomb. The sheer audacity of his life, his dramatic reforms, his multiple marriages, all culminated in this quiet, yet undeniably grand arrival at his chosen sepulchre. The funeral car would be carefully brought to a halt at the entrance to the vault, a testament to the engineering and foresight involved in the entire process. The horses would be unhitched, their work done. The final act of moving the coffin into its resting place would begin, an operation requiring immense strength and careful coordination. The air inside the chapel, already cool, would seem to grow colder, charged with the weight of centuries of history and the fresh arrival of another monarch to the long line of deceased kings and queens interred within these walls. The procession had delivered its charge, and now the final preparations for interment could commence. The vast royal apparatus, which had laboured for days to bring Henry to this point, would now focus its efforts on sealing him away forever. The colossal coffin, having completed its long and solemn journey from Whitehall, now stood poised at the entrance to St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The grandeur of its arrival, the tolling bells, the hushed crowds, all culminated in this final, most intimate phase, the lowering of the king into his chosen vault. The atmosphere within the chapel, already thick with history and ceremony, became charged with an almost palpable solemnity as the massive hearse drew to a halt. St. George's Chapel is not merely a building, it is a monument, a royal necropolis, a place where the echoes of centuries of English monarchy reside. Henry VIII had chosen this site with purpose, specifically the vault within the choir, intended to house himself and his beloved third wife, Jane Seymour. The vault itself, a subterranean chamber beneath the ornate floor, had been prepared meticulously. Imagine the masons and workmen toiling in the chilly, damp confines, ensuring its readiness for such a monumental occupant. The air in such a space, even before Henry's arrival, would have been cool, carrying the faint earthy scent of ancient stone and undisturbed earth. As the funeral car came to a complete stop, the first, most formidable challenge presented itself. Moving the immense lead-lined oak coffin from the car into the chapel, and then, ultimately, into the vault. This was an operation requiring immense physical strength, precise coordination, and unwavering care. The coffin, already described as incredibly heavy, would have been manoeuvred by a large team of specially chosen bearers, likely men of great physical stature and trusted loyalty. They would have worked in silent, strained unison, their muscles taut, their breaths clouding in the cool air of the chapel. One can almost hear the grunts of effort, the soft scrape of the heavy wooden runners on the stone floor as they painstakingly inched the great box forward. The path to the vault was not a simple straight line. The coffin would have been wheeled or carried down the central aisle of the choir, past the stalls of the Knights of the Garter under the magnificent vaulted ceiling. Every step would have been slow, deliberate, a final ceremonial progress for the king. The mourners, now gathered within the chapel, would have stood in hushed reverence, their eyes fixed on the immense coffin, a silent testament to the king's finality. Clergy would continue their low, mournful chants, their voices echoing softly in the cavernous space, adding to the pervasive sense of gravitas. The opening to the vault itself would have been revealed, typically by removing a section of the chapel's paving stones. This would expose a dark rectangular aperture leading down into the subterranean chamber. The sight of this open maw, ready to swallow the king, must have been a powerful, visceral reminder of mortality for all assembled. This was the moment of no return, the sealing away of a life that had, for so long, dominated the very fabric of England. Specialised lifting equipment, rudimentary by modern standards but effective for the time, would have been employed to carefully lower the coffin. This might have involved ropes and pulleys, or perhaps a sturdy wooden ramp. The danger of mishap, of such an immense weight crashing or tilting, would have been ever present, demanding absolute precision from the bearers. Historians still argue whether the coffin was lowered directly into its final position or placed on a temporary platform within the vault before being settled. The exact mechanics of such heavy burials are not always perfectly detailed in contemporary accounts, leading to fascinating, if slightly macabre, speculation. As the coffin began its slow descent, a final series of rituals would have unfolded above. the Garter King of Arms would step forward, perhaps breaking his white staff of office over the coffin, a symbolic act marking the formal end of the king's service to the earthly realm. Other symbols of royal authority, such as the crown, sceptre and orb, which had been carried in the procession, might have been laid upon the coffin or on the platform above the vault, before it disappeared from view. These were potent symbols signifying that while the man was gone, the institution of the monarchy endured. The atmosphere in the vault itself, once the coffin was finally lowered, would have been one of profound stillness. The chamber, designed for eternity, would then be sealed. Often this involved the laying of a heavy stone slab over the opening, sometimes carved with the king's name and regnal dates, permanently closing off the entrance. The masons would then replace the chapel's paving stones, meticulously restoring the floor to its original appearance, as if the gaping maw had never been there. The process of sealing could be quick, a deliberate act of closure, or it could be a more drawn-out affair, involving the precise fitting of multiple stone blocks. The preparation of the vault itself before the coffin's arrival involved more than just clearing space. It entailed ensuring structural integrity, particularly given the immense weight it would bear. The floor of the vault, whether simple earth or paved, would need to be level and capable of supporting the multi-ton burden. Air circulation, or rather the lack of it, would be a consideration for preservation, though Tudor understanding of such things was limited. It was more about preventing immediate collapse or noxious fumes than long-term environmental control. Within the vault, the coffin was intended to rest alongside Jane Seymour, a poignant testament to Henry's enduring affection for the one wife who had given him a male heir. Her tomb, already present, would now be joined by his, a silent reunion within the confines of the earth. The presence of Jane's coffin would have dictated the exact placement of Henry's, ensuring they lay in close proximity, fulfilling his wishes. This intimate detail, despite the grandeur of the public ceremony, adds a touch of profound personal meaning to the king's final resting place. The chapel itself would have undergone significant transformations to accommodate the sheer scale of the funeral. Temporary structures such as additional scaffolding for hangings or a temporary platform for dignitaries might have been erected. Every surface would have been draped in black, from the soaring pillars to the intricate stalls, creating an overwhelming sense of mourning. The light already filtered through the stained glass windows would be further subdued by the vast swathes of dark fabric, lending an almost theatrical gloom to the proceedings. The lingering smell within the chapel, even after the coffin was sealed away, would be a peculiar blend. The heavy scent of beeswax from countless candles, the sweet musky odour of incense and the faint unavoidable trace of the embalming spices would hang in the air for days, a sensory echo of the momentous event. It was a scent of sanctity and sorrow, a powerful reminder of the ephemeral nature of even absolute power. For those present, particularly the young King Edward VI, this would have been a deeply impactful moment. Witnessing his father, the formidable figure who had ruled England with an iron fist, finally lowered into the earth, would have been a stark lesson in mortality and the weight of the crown he now bore. The transition of power was now complete, both ceremonially and physically. The king was finally at rest, sealed away from the world he had so dramatically reshaped. The immediate aftermath of the burial would have involved the methodical dismantling of the temporary funeral trappings. The black hangings would be taken down, the candles removed, and the chapel would slowly begin to return to its regular, though now subtly altered state. But the memory of the event, the sight of that massive coffin disappearing into the depths of the vault, would undoubtedly linger in the minds of all who witnessed it. The preparation of the vault also included considerations for the long term. While Henry's coffin was the most immediate concern, the vault was a royal burial site, and it was expected to house other members of the royal family in due course. This foresight in planning for future interments is a quirky detail, suggesting a rather practical approach to royal mortality. Yes, we'll put the king here, but we need to leave room for Aunt Mildred when her time comes. The final sealing of the vault marked a point of no return. From that moment, Henry VIII would be an inhabitant of history, his physical presence confined to the darkness beneath St. George's Chapel. The immense efforts, the vast expense, the meticulous planning, all culminated in this quiet, final act of closure. The whispers of his reign, his triumphs and his terrors, would now rise from the silence of his tomb, echoing through the annals of English history. The vault's sombre echoes, once sounds of preparation, were now those of eternal rest, or at least that was the intention. With the colossal coffin of Henry VIII finally lowered into the vault beneath the choir of St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the grand public spectacle of his funeral drew to its profound conclusion. The heavy stone slab, perhaps carved with a simple inscription, or left starkly plain, was meticulously placed over the entrance to the vault, sealing the king away from the world he had so dramatically dominated. Masons with practised hands then restored the chapel's paving stones, leaving no outward trace of the momentous opening that had swallowed a king. The chapel, slowly but surely, began to shed its outward trappings of mourning, returning to its everyday functions, though forever imprinted with the memory of the immense funeral that had just taken place. The burial ceremony itself was a complex tapestry of religious rites, ancient traditions and solemn pronouncements, all designed to ensure the king's soul found repose and to legitimise the new reign of Edward VI. The rituals began with the lowering of the coffin, a process accompanied by the continuous chanting of prayers for the dead. The traditional Latin Mass for the dead, Requiem Aeternam, would have been central, its sombre melodies filling the vast space of the chapel. The clergy, arrayed in their most solemn vestments, would have performed these rites with a grave intensity, their voices echoing in the vaulted ceiling. As the coffin descended, symbols of Henry's earthly power would have been formally surrendered. The Garter King of Arms, in a poignant and dramatic gesture, would traditionally break his white staff of office over the now hidden vault, symbolising the dissolution of his service to the deceased monarch. The royal standard, the banners of his achievements, and perhaps even the king's personal arms would have been formally taken down or placed in a position signifying his passing. These acts were not merely ceremonial, they were deeply symbolic, marking the definitive end of one reign and the formal beginning of another. Historians still argue whether the breaking of the staff had any deeper legal or political significance beyond its ceremonial aspect, or if it was simply a well-established tradition of royal funerals. The eulogy, a crucial part of any significant funeral, would have been delivered by a prominent cleric, likely a bishop, or even the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. This address would not only extol the virtues of the departed king, perhaps overlooking his more controversial qualities, but also affirm the divine right of his successor. It was a delicate balance of remembrance and political reinforcement. The orator would speak of Henry's piety, his wisdom, his strength, and his contributions to the realm, framing his reign in the most favourable light possible. It was in essence the ultimate historical spin. During the service, the offering of symbolic gifts would have taken place. Various nobles and high-ranking officials would approach the altar, presenting offerings of gold, silver or other valuable items, ostensibly for the repose of the king's soul and for charitable works in his memory. This tradition served both as an act of piety and a public display of loyalty to the deceased monarch and, by extension, to the new regime. It was a moment of public fealty, a silent pledge of allegiance under the shadow of death. The presence of the new king, Edward VI, though a mere boy, would have been acutely felt. His guardians and advisers would have ensured his prominent yet carefully managed presence at the service. For Edward, witnessing his colossal father disappear into the earth must have been a profoundly unsettling experience, marking the abrupt transition from childhood to the immense responsibilities of kingship. He was the living embodiment of the continuity, the thread linking the past, the present, and the future of the English monarchy. The sheer length and formality of the burial service would have been exhaustive. For hours the assembled mourners, dressed in their heavy black attire, would stand or kneel, participating in the solemn rites. The air would be heavy with the scent of incense, the drone of prayers, and the collective sighs of exhaustion and grief. It was an endurance test for all involved, a testament to the importance placed on proper ceremonial closure for a monarch of Henry's stature. Imagine trying to stay awake and attentive through what amounted to a medieval marathon service, particularly for those whose minds might already be turning to the inevitable political machinations that followed a king's death. One quirky tidbit about royal burials of this era is the practice of leaving a small opening in the vault or coffin, or sometimes placing a simple pipe to allow for the release of gases from the decomposing body. While not always explicitly mentioned for Henry VIII, this was a common, pragmatic solution to a rather unpleasant problem. It's a rather unglamorous detail in an otherwise meticulously grand affair, a stark reminder of the biological realities that even kings could not escape. Following the main burial service, a series of commemorative masses and services would have been held over the ensuing days and weeks, both in St. George's Chapel and across the kingdom. These continued prayers were believed to further assist the king's soul in purgatory, a concept still very much alive for many in England despite Henry's own break with Rome. This open scholarly debate continues among historians. To what extent did traditional Catholic eschatology persist in the Reformed Church of England regarding royal burials? The blending of old and new traditions was often fluid in this transitional period. The placement of Henry's coffin within the vault next to that of Jane Seymour was a deliberate fulfilment of his final wishes. This particular location, rather than a separate grand tomb, underscored his affection for her and perhaps a desire for a more intimate, if still regal, resting place. For centuries they would lie side by side, a silent testament to a complex, powerful, and ultimately deeply personal bond that transcended the political and religious upheavals of his reign. This intimate detail, almost incongruous with the public pomp of his funeral, offers a glimpse into the king's private heart. The departure of the assembled mourners from the chapel would have been a slow, quiet affair. The vast numbers of people, from the highest nobles to the lowliest servants, would disperse, their duties fulfilled. The sound of their retreating footsteps would echo in the now quieter chapel, leaving behind only the ghosts of the ceremony and the silent, permanent presence of the king's tomb. The great chapel, relieved of its immense burden, would slowly return to its sacred silence, its role as a royal mausoleum cemented once more. The burial of Henry VIII was not just an end, it was a beginning. It marked the formal inauguration of Edward VI's reign, the continuation of the Tudor dynasty, and the consolidation of the reforms Henry had initiated. The solemnity and grandeur of the ceremony were designed to convey stability and legitimacy in a time of potential uncertainty. Every prayer, every symbol, every solemn step taken by the mourners was a testament to the enduring power of the monarchy and the intricate web of belief and tradition that surrounded it. The very air in the chapel, even after everyone had left, seemed to hum with the lingering energy of the event. The scent of extinguished candles, the faint sweetness of dried incense, and perhaps a subtle, almost imperceptible coolness in the spot where the vault lay, would remain as silent witnesses. The stones of the chapel, which had absorbed the weight of so many centuries, now held the final weight of England's most transformative king. The meticulous records kept by the royal household and other chroniclers of the time provide historians with a rich, if sometimes fragmented, insight into the specifics of these ceremonies. These documents, detailing everything from the expenditure on black cloth to the names of the coffin bearers, allow us to reconstruct with remarkable accuracy the solemn choreography of such a royal funeral. They paint a vivid picture of a society deeply rooted in ritual and symbolism, where death, especially royal death, was a public affair of immense significance. The final closure of the vault, the restoration of the chapel floor, marked the point where Henry VIII transitioned from a living, breathing, terrifyingly real presence into a figure of history, confined to the narratives and interpretations of future generations. His physical form was now interred, but his legacy, both celebrated and debated, would continue to reverberate through the ages. The silence of his tomb would eventually give way to the gentle hum of historical inquiry, as curious minds sought to understand the man and the monumental forces he unleashed upon the world. The burial ceremony was not merely a farewell, it was the consecration of a legend. With the grand burial ceremony concluded and the heavy stone slab sealed back over the vault, Henry VIII was ostensibly laid to rest. However, the immediate aftermath of a royal interment, particularly for a monarch as impactful and complex as Henry, was rarely a period of quietude. The silence of the tomb was often a stark contrast to the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, disturbances that rippled through the kingdom and indeed within the very walls of St. George's Chapel itself. The settling of a multi-ton coffin, even in a purpose-built vault, could never be entirely without incident. The initial days and weeks following the burial would have been a period of adjustment. The new reign of Edward VI, under the watchful eyes of his regents, was still finding its footing. The immense apparatus of the royal household, which had been so focused on the funeral, would now begin to reorient itself. Yet, the memory of the king, both the formidable man and the solemn spectacle of his passing, would linger. Within St. George's Chapel, the most immediate disturbances, if one could call them that, would have been purely physical. The immense weight of the lead-lined oak coffin, now settled into its resting place alongside Jane Seymour, would exert significant pressure on its supports and the vault floor. Over time, and with the natural settling of foundations, there might have been imperceptible shifts, tiny creaks and groans from the ancient structure itself, sounds only truly noticed by those who spent countless hours within the chapel walls. These were the quiet whispers of a building adapting to its new, colossal resident. More tangibly, there was the ongoing process of decomposition, however meticulously the embalming had been carried out. Tudor embalming was designed to delay, not prevent, the inevitable. While the lead lining was intended to be airtight, perfect seals are notoriously difficult to achieve, especially with the technology of the day. Over time, gases would build up within the coffin. This is where that quirky tidbit about a small vent or pipe becomes relevant, a practical measure to prevent the coffin from becoming, shall we say, unpleasantly bloated or even rupturing. Historians still argue whether such a vent was always a standard feature, or if it was sometimes improvised based on the perceived necessity for particularly large or volatile bodies. The debate centres on how much forensic knowledge medieval and Tudor embalmers truly possessed beyond practical observation. The air in the immediate vicinity of the vault, even above ground, might have carried faint, almost imperceptible traces of the chemical reactions occurring beneath. While most odours would be contained, the sheer volume of decomposition could, over months and years, subtly alter the atmosphere in the deep recesses of the chapel. It's a macabre thought, a king's final silent contribution to the chapel's olfactory signature. Beyond the physical settling, there were the disturbances of human activity. While the tomb was sealed, it was not entirely forgotten. Kings, even dead ones, remained points of interest, and St George's Chapel was a place of ongoing worship and royal events. Tourists, pilgrims, and future generations of royalty would visit, their footsteps echoing near the very spot where Henry lay. While direct access to the vault was impossible, the knowledge of his presence beneath the floor would add a certain weight to the atmosphere for many. The political landscape, too, contributed to a kind of disturbance around the tomb. Henry's will, which laid out the succession and the regency for Edward VI, was a powerful document. However, its interpretation and implementation led to immediate power struggles amongst the nobility, most notably between Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. These political machinations, driven by ambition and religious divides, were a direct consequence of Henry's death and his often contradictory legacy. While the king lay silent in his coffin, the battles for control of his kingdom raged on above him, a tumultuous counterpoint to his supposed eternal peace. The religious reforms initiated by Henry, particularly the break with Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries, continued to be a source of profound upheaval. Edward VI's reign saw further, more radical Protestant reforms, which would have been viewed by some as an affront to traditional piety, even if it was technically built on his father's foundations. For others, it was the fulfilment of a divine mandate. This ongoing theological unrest, a direct consequence of Henry's choices, permeated the air, even within the sacred spaces he had helped reshape. The ghost of his religious policies haunted the very institutions he had sought to control. There were also practical disturbances related to the chapel itself. St George's Chapel, like any ancient building, required ongoing maintenance and occasional repairs. Over the decades, builders and masons would have worked within its walls, their activities potentially causing minor vibrations or shifts that, while insignificant to the structure, might have subtly disturbed the silence of the vault below. Imagine the low thud of hammers, the scrape of stone filtering down into the perpetual darkness where the great king lay. One particularly poignant historical fact is that within the same vault, some years after Henry's burial, the body of his executed minister, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, was also interred, albeit temporarily. Norfolk had been condemned by Henry just before the king's death, but his execution was delayed. He ultimately died in the Tower of London. His body was initially buried elsewhere, but later moved to St George's Chapel. While not directly next to Henry in the same compartment, the presence of someone condemned by the king in the same sacred space highlights the strange, often contradictory nature of Tudor power and patronage. It's a peculiar twist of fate, almost as if Henry couldn't quite escape the men he had judged, even in death. Historians still argue whether the choice of this specific vault rather than a grander, standalone tomb which Henry had initially planned at Windsor and Wolsey's tomb at Westminster, suggests a last-minute decision influenced by his deteriorating health or a shift in his spiritual outlook towards a more humble resting place. The relative simplicity of the burial compared to the initial grand plans is a point of ongoing scholarly debate, offering insights into Henry's final mindset. The immediate years after Henry's death were marked by further significant royal burials within St. George's Chapel, though not necessarily in the same vault. Edward VI himself would die young and be buried at Westminster, but other members of the royal family or high-ranking nobles connected to the Tudors would find their final resting places in the various chapels and crypts of Windsor. Each new interment would bring a flurry of activity, fresh mourners, and renewed focus on the solemn role of the chapel as a royal mausoleum, indirectly recalling Henry's own monumental passing. The quiet, almost imperceptible disturbances, whether from the settling of the coffin, the natural processes of decay, or the lingering echoes of political and religious turmoil, all contributed to the enduring mystique of Henry VIII's tomb. It was not a static, unchanging monument from the moment the stone was laid. It was a place that continued to breathe, to subtly shift, and to carry the weight of a nation's history, even in the profound silence of its subterranean depths. The king, though physically at rest, continued to exert his influence, both directly and indirectly through the legacy he left behind. The coffin itself, now hidden from view, became a silent witness to the continuing saga of the Tudor dynasty. As the turbulent years of Edward VI's reign, marked by radical Protestant reforms and intense political factionalism, gave way to the equally dramatic though contrasting period of Mary the Woman's Catholic restoration, Henry V's coffin lay undisturbed beneath St. George's Chapel. However, it was during the long and relatively stable reign of his second daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, that the tomb settled into a new kind of existence, becoming less a focal point of fresh grief and more a quiescent yet significant historical landmark. Elizabeth, ever the pragmatist, understood the power of her father's legacy, even as she carefully navigated her own path. For much of Elizabeth's reign, 1558 to 1603, the tomb of Henry VIII was not a site of public display or regular visitation in the modern sense. It was a royal burial vault, respected and understood as such, but not necessarily a pilgrimage site. The chapel continued its daily round of worship, and while the presence of the powerful king beneath its floor was known, it largely remained unseen, a silent weight in the hallowed ground. The primary interaction with the tomb during this period would have been the regular maintenance of the chapel itself, cleaning, minor repairs, and the ongoing care of the fabric of the building. These activities, though mundane, would have ensured the continued undisturbed rest of its most famous occupant. Elizabeth's own relationship with her father's memory was complex. She owed her very legitimacy to his break with Rome and his subsequent establishment of the Church of England. Yet his treatment of her mother, Anne Boleyn, and the constant threat of being declared illegitimate cast a long shadow. Thus, while she upheld his religious settlement in essence, though with her own distinct flavour, she rarely invoked his name with the same passionate reverence that she might have afforded other royal ancestors. Her approach to his tomb reflected this nuanced stance, respectful recognition, but without excessive veneration that might draw attention to the more problematic aspects of his life. The political stability that Elizabeth largely managed to maintain meant fewer immediate disturbances around the royal tombs. Unlike the rapid succession of monarchs and religious upheavals of the mid-16th century, Elizabeth's long reign allowed for a period of relative calm. The great theological debates continued, of course, but the physical acts of burying or reburying monarchs, or radically altering church interiors, were less frequent. This gave Henry's resting place a chance to truly settle, becoming an established part of the chapel's sacred geography. Within the chapel, the atmosphere remained one of dignity and reverence. The sounds would be those of daily services, the rustle of vestments, the murmur of prayers, the solemn intonation of the liturgy, and the occasional creak of ancient wooden stalls. The light filtered through the glorious stained glass would have cast shifting patterns on the stone floor, directly above where the king lay. The persistent cool air of the chapel, tinged with the scent of old stone and lingering incense, would have been the only constant companion to the entombed monarch. One mainstream historical fact regarding this period is that during Elizabeth's reign, there was a growing interest in antiquarianism and the study of English history. Scholars and gentleman antiquaries began to meticulously record and document historical sites, including royal tombs, while direct excavation or disturbance of Henry VIII's vault was not on the agenda. This burgeoning intellectual curiosity meant that his existence and the location of his burial became increasingly well known and documented in scholarly circles. This was the quiet dawn of historical preservation, driven by a desire to understand the past. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era relates to the popular superstitions surrounding royal deaths and burials. Despite the official Protestant stance, many ordinary people still harboured traditional beliefs about the power of the deceased, particularly kings, to influence events from beyond the grave. There might have been whispers among the common folk about the spirit of Henry VIII, perhaps restless due to his dramatic life, or offering some unseen protection to his kingdom. Such folk beliefs, often dismissed by the educated elite, persisted in the shadows, adding a layer of subtle, almost mystical significance to the tomb for some. This brings us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's decision not to build a more elaborate freestanding tomb for her father, as was common for monarchs of his stature, and as he himself had initially planned, was due to financial constraints, a conscious desire to distance herself from some of his more controversial actions, or simply a reflection of changing funerary customs. The fact that he remained in the modest, by royal standards, vault, rather than a grand effigy-topped monument, invites fascinating speculation about her true feelings and priorities. The proximity of Henry VIII's tomb to that of Jane Seymour continued to be a poignant detail. Their enduring silent companionship below the chapel floor stood as a quiet testament to their brief, yet profoundly impactful union. For Elizabeth, this shared resting place also subtly highlighted her own mother's absence from such a dignified sepulchre, a silent reminder of the complexities of her own lineage. It also marked the vault as uniquely Tudor, a familial resting place rather than a mere holding ground for a single king. Towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, as the question of succession loomed large and her own mortality became a palpable concern, there might have been renewed attention to royal burial practices and dynastic continuity. The tombs of past monarchs, including Henry VIII, served as a tangible link to the long line of English rulers, reinforcing the historical legitimacy of the throne. His tomb, therefore, became a quiet symbol of endurance, a testament to the stability of the institution even as individual reigns came and went. The sounds within the chapel during this period would have been largely unchanging. The regular chiming of the chapel clock, the creak of the organ during services, the measured footsteps of canons and choristers. Below, in the vault, the silence would be almost absolute, broken only by the infinitesimal settling of stone or perhaps the distant muffled echo of activity from above. The embalmed king, shrouded in lead and oak, would continue his long, undisturbed repose, a silent witness to the passage of Elizabethan England. The relative lack of immediate direct interaction with the tomb during Elizabeth's long reign allowed the natural processes of decomposition, however slowed by the embalming and lead lining, to continue unimpeded. The gases would have continued to generate, the internal structures of the body would have further collapsed, and the coffin itself, while robust, would undergo its own subtle changes over decades. The environment of the vault, cool and consistent, would have created a microclimate unique to the silent chamber. The overall impression of Henry VIII's coffin during the Elizabethan era was one of static, respectful presence. It was not a place of active commemoration in the way, say, a shrine might be, but rather a permanent marker of royal death and dynastic continuity. The gaze of the Elizabethan era focused on establishing its own identity and securing the Protestant future of the nation, acknowledged the paternal legacy of Henry VIII without dwelling excessively on his physical remains. He was a foundational figure, a historical force, now quietly entombed, allowing the living to shape the future. The enduring presence of his coffin underscored the permanence of the monarchy, a silent, weighty anchor in the shifting tides of history. The long, relatively stable reign of Elizabeth I, which had seen Henry VIII's coffin quietly settle into its permanent repose, eventually gave way to the dawn of a new dynasty, the Stuarts. With James VI of Scotland becoming James I of England in 1603, the relationship between the living monarch and the deceased Tudor powerhouse shifted once more. the Stuart kings, while acknowledging their Tudor predecessors, began to define their own legacy, often with different priorities and a distinct approach to royal remembrance. This era, encompassing the reigns of James I and Charles I, saw the tomb continue its quiet existence, yet subtly influenced by the changing attitudes of the new royal house. James I, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and therefore a descendant of Henry VIII's elder sister Margaret, understood the importance of legitimising his claim to the English throne through his Tudor lineage. His arrival in England was met with both relief and apprehension, and establishing his bona fides as the rightful successor was paramount. Thus, while he naturally focused on his own kingship, he also ensured that the veneration of past monarchs, including Henry VIII, continued respectfully. St George's Chapel remained a pivotal royal mausoleum, and the presence of Henry's tomb within it contributed to the chapel's enduring significance. For James, the tomb of Henry VIII was a tangible link to the past, a silent endorsement of his inherited right to rule. However, James's own intellectual pursuits and his vision of kingship, leaning heavily into the concept of the divine right of kings, sometimes contrasted with Henry's more tumultuous, if effective, approach to governance. Therefore the tomb was acknowledged, but perhaps not celebrated with the same kind of emotional intensity that a son might afford a father. It was a respected ancestral shrine rather than a personal site of mourning. The early Stuart period brought a renewed focus on the grandeur and sacredness of the monarchy, often expressed through elaborate court ceremonies and architectural projects. While no significant additions were made to Henry's tomb itself, the surrounding chapel continued to be maintained and adorned, ensuring its regal dignity. The routine of daily worship, the solemn offices, and the occasional grand royal ceremony continued within St George's, the sounds echoing above the silent resting place of the formidable Tudor king. The cool, consistent temperature of the vault below ensured a steady environment for the coffin, undisturbed by the changing fashions and politics above. One mainstream historical fact from this period that indirectly pertains to Henry's tomb is James I's ardent belief in the sanctity of royal bodies. James was famously interested in the supernatural and the symbolic, and the physical remains of monarchs held a particular fascination for him. He ensured the proper reinterment of his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, at Westminster Abbey, signifying a deep reverence for the corporeal legacy of kings and queens. While he didn't disturb Henry's tomb, this broader royal philosophy meant that the inherent dignity of Henry's burial site was maintained and respected. A quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the growing intellectual interest in genealogy and royal lineage during the early Stuart era. With a new dynasty on the throne, there was a keen effort to map out the intricate connections between the Stuarts and the Tudors. Genealogists and antiquaries would meticulously pore over records of royal births, deaths, and marriages, effectively creating a family tree that stretched back centuries. This scholarly obsession, though not directly involving the physical coffin, meant that Henry VIII's burial became a point of significant historical reference in these burgeoning genealogical studies, a fixed point in the royal narrative. This leads to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Stuart kings, particularly James I, subtly attempted to downplay certain aspects of Henry VIII's reign, such as his multiple marriages or the more brutal aspects of his religious policies, in favour of emphasising his role in establishing the independent Church of England, which aligned more closely with their own Protestant monarchical vision. The way Henry's legacy was interpreted and presented during this era could indirectly affect the public's conceptual relationship with his tomb, even if it remained physically untouched. The reign of Charles I, which followed James I, eventually plunged England into the turmoil of the Civil War. Before this cataclysm, Charles, like his father, maintained a respect for the royal tombs. He was a devout High Anglican, deeply committed to the ceremonial and hierarchical aspects of the Church of England, a church shaped by his grandfather Henry VIII. For Charles, the sanctity of royal burial sites would have been unquestionable, an extension of the divine right he so fervently believed in. The sounds within the chapel during the early Stuart period would have continued their dignified cadence. The grand swells of the organ, the measured voices of the choir, the quiet rustle of prayer books. The light streaming through the stained glass would have cast its shifting colours on the stone floor, a silent ballet above the entombed king. Below, in the undisturbed vault, Henry's coffin remained in perpetual darkness, a heavy, silent presence. The slow processes of internal decay would have continued, contained within the lead, the atmosphere inside the coffin a sealed, anoxic environment. The vault was not meant to be accessed casually. Its reopening would be a monumental undertaking, only for specific necessary reasons, such as the interment of another royal family member if the primary royal vault was full or deemed unsuitable. For Henry VIII, his resting place was fixed. The knowledge of his presence, however, would always lend a unique gravitas to the chapel, a powerful reminder of the deep roots of the English monarchy. The Stuart focus on establishing their own unique royal identity also meant that new burial sites and commemorative projects were sometimes considered. While Henry's tomb was respected, it didn't necessarily receive the same kind of architectural or artistic attention as newly proposed projects. This was a dynasty looking forward, even as it acknowledged its past. The continuity was important, but the future was paramount. The changing political climate, even before the full onset of the Civil War, would have brought its own subtle disturbances. Arguments over royal prerogative, parliamentary power, and religious practice would echo in the halls of the palace, and even within the hallowed confines of the chapel. While the coffin itself remained undisturbed, the national discourse surrounding it, the very ideas that Henry had brought into being, continued to evolve and often clash. It's as if the ghost of his policies continued to stir the living, even as his body lay still. The reverence shown to royal tombs during this period was a reflection of a broader societal belief in the inherent sacredness of monarchy. Kings were seen as God's anointed, and even in death their physical remains held a special sanctity. This belief, however, would be severely tested in the turbulent decades that followed, casting a long shadow over the fate of all royal tombs, including Henry VIII's. For the ordinary person in the Stuart era, Henry VIII was still a towering figure of history, perhaps viewed with a mix of awe and trepidation. His story, passed down through generations, remained a vivid part of the national consciousness. His tomb, though unseen by most, was a potent symbol of that history, a silent landmark marking the spot where a defining era had come to rest. The treatment of the tomb during the Stuart period, therefore, was largely one of respectful neglect, an acknowledgement of its historical significance without active intervention or extensive new commemoration. It was a place where history lay quietly buried, waiting for future generations to uncover its secrets. The quiet, dignified repose that Henry VIII's coffin had enjoyed under the early Stuarts was shattered by the cataclysmic events of the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, and the subsequent establishment of the Commonwealth. This was a period of unprecedented upheaval, where the very foundations of monarchy and established religion were violently overthrown. For the royal tombs, particularly those within perceived symbols of royal and ecclesiastical power like St. George's Chapel, this era brought not only neglect but also the very real threat of desecration. With the execution of Charles I in 1649, an act that sent shockwaves across Europe, the sanctity of kingship, and by extension royal burial sites, was brutally undermined. The monarchy was abolished, and England declared a republic. For those zealous parliamentarians and radical Puritans, the elaborate rituals and symbols of monarchy in the Anglican Church were anathema, seen as popish relics and idolatrous distractions from true piety. Royal tombs, particularly those embodying the divine right that the executed king had championed, became targets for scorn, neglect, and in some cases, outright vandalism. St. George's Chapel, Windsor, a bastion of royalist sentiment and a repository of royal history, was not immune to this anti-monarchical fervour. It was stripped of its royal trappings, its precious artefacts, and its elaborate decorations. The lead from the chapel roof was reportedly stripped for military purposes, and many of its stained glass windows were smashed, seen as promoting idolatry. The very air of the chapel, once thick with incense and solemn prayers, now held the chill of desolation and the echoes of iconoclastic fury. For Henry VIII's coffin, lying in the vault beneath the choir, this period meant a profound shift from respectful quietude to a state of complete disregard, if not outright danger. The vault itself, a sealed chamber, offered some physical protection from immediate direct vandalism. However, the general atmosphere of neglect and contempt for all things royal meant that its integrity was not a priority. Any structural issues, any minor leakages or shifts would have gone unaddressed. The silence of the vault would have been deeper, but also more desolate during these years. While there are no definitive accounts of the vault of Henry VIII being deliberately broken into or extensively plundered during the Commonwealth, the threat was very real. Other royal tombs and church monuments across England suffered significant damage. The bodies of some monarchs, like Edward the Confessor at Westminster Abbey, were reportedly disturbed, their coffins opened and their remains exposed. The zealous reformers sought to erase the symbols of what they viewed as a corrupt past. It would not be an unreasonable stretch to imagine a few particularly fervent individuals contemplating a similar fate for the architect of the Church of England, the very man whose controversial actions had ironically set the stage for such radical change. One mainstream historical fact from this period is the burial of Charles I himself. After his execution, Charles I's body was brought to Windsor and interred in the same vault as Henry VIII, an extraordinary and deeply ironic twist of fate. The regicides, perhaps seeking to avoid creating a martyr's shrine in Westminster Abbey, chose Windsor. This meant that the deposed and executed Stuart king came to lie alongside the very Tudor monarch who had asserted such absolute power. The presence of Charles III's coffin would have added a new, poignant and decidedly unroyal weight to the already immense contents of the vault. Historians still argue whether this specific burial location was chosen purely for pragmatic reasons, security, lack of alternatives, or if there was a subtle, symbolic intent by parliamentarians to demean the monarchy by placing Charles I in a shared, relatively humble vault rather than a grand individual tomb. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to the Commonwealth period is the rumour, persistent among some royalists at the time, that the parliamentarians might secretly have intended to remove or even destroy the remains of past monarchs, including Henry VIII, to further obliterate the concept of royal lineage. While no evidence supports this extreme action for Henry, the very existence of such rumours highlights the pervasive fear and deep-seated animosity towards the old order. It speaks to the psychological warfare being waged, where even the dead were not safe from political narratives. The sounds within St. George's Chapel during the Commonwealth would have been starkly different. The joyous peal of bells, the rich harmonies of the choir, and the solemn tones of the organ would have been replaced by a chilling silence. Or perhaps the mundane sounds of workmen, or even, more chillingly, the occasional sermon of a Puritan minister railing against the superstitions and popery of the past. The light filtering through the now broken stained-glass windows would have been harsher, less colourful, casting a desolate pall over the stripped-down interior. Below in the vault the two kings, the absolute and the executed, lay in silent, ironic proximity, undisturbed by the ideological storms raging above. The systematic dismantling of royal institutions extended to the very care and maintenance of the chapel. Without royal patronage, and with a regime actively hostile to its former purpose, resources for upkeep would have dried up. This meant increased exposure to dampness, potential vermin infestation, and general environmental degradation within the chapel, and by extension, the vault. The delicate balance of preservation within the coffin, already a challenge for Tudor embalmers, would have faced new stresses from the changing conditions above. The neglect of the Commonwealth period was a profound departure from centuries of royal tradition. Prior to this, even in times of war or dynastic change, royal tombs generally retained a degree of sanctity. The radical nature of the Commonwealth's anti-monarchical stance meant that this traditional respect was severely curtailed. For Henry VIII's coffin, it meant a period of profound vulnerability, a time when the very idea of a king's eternal rest was called into question by the living. The lack of records regarding the vault during this period also contributes to its mystique. With the collapse of traditional court administration, the meticulous record-keeping of royal deaths and burials often ceased or became fragmented. This absence of clear documentation leaves a void, allowing for speculation about what might or might not have occurred in the darkness of the vault. It's a silence that speaks volumes about the tumultuous times. The interment of Charles I alongside Henry VIII within the vault is a powerful historical lesson in the unpredictable currents of power. Charles, who championed the divine right of kings, found his final resting place beside the monarch who had established the Church of England, paving the way for the very religious and political conflicts that led to Charles's downfall. It's a rather darkly humorous twist of fate, a silent subterranean drama playing out beneath the feet of a Republican government. Fancy meeting you here, old chap. One can almost hear the ghost of Henry quipping to the new arrival. Bit of a demotion, eh? Ultimately, the Commonwealth period represented a nadir for royal tombs. While Henry VIII's coffin likely remained intact due to its robustness and the relative obscurity of its location beneath the floor, it existed in an environment devoid of the reverence and care it had previously commanded. It was a time when the very concept of monarchy was being deconstructed, and even the dead kings felt the chill wind of republicanism. The coffin, once a symbol of continuity, became a silent witness to discontinuity, awaiting the day when the wheel of fortune might turn once more. The bleak period of the Commonwealth, a time of neglect and potential peril for royal tombs, finally drew to a close with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Charles II, son of the executed Charles I, returned to England, ending the Republican experiment and bringing with him a fervent desire to re-establish the traditional grandeur and sanctity of the crown. For St. George's Chapel and its royal occupants, including Henry VIII, this marked a profound shift from desolation to renewed reverence and meticulous, if sometimes misguided, care. Charles II's immediate priorities included restoring order, consolidating his power, and, significantly, re-establishing the Church of England. Integral to this was the symbolic resurrection of the monarchy's dignity, which extended directly to the treatment of royal burial sites. The shocking act of regicide and the subsequent neglect of royal monuments during the interregnum had deeply offended the sensibilities of many. Charles II, therefore, embarked on a deliberate campaign to undo the damage, both physically and symbolically. For St. George's Chapel, this meant a concerted effort to repair the depredations of the Civil War. Windows were repaired, often with new, sometimes less intricate glass, replacing the shattered originals. The lead stripped from the roof was replaced, and the general fabric of the building was attended to. The atmosphere within the chapel gradually transformed from one of desolate emptiness to one of returning solemnity and sacred purpose. The sounds of prayer and worship, long suppressed, once again filled the ancient space, echoing off the restored vaulted ceilings. The most poignant act of restoration related to the royal tombs was the solemn reinterment of Charles I's body. Having been buried almost surreptitiously in the same vault as Henry VIII during the Commonwealth, Charles II ordered a dignified reburial. While his father's body remained in the shared vault, Charles II ensured that it was acknowledged with due ceremony, implicitly restoring the sanctity of the royal resting place. This act, more than any other, signalled the renewed respect for the dead monarchs of England. For Henry VIII's coffin, lying in its leaden embrace, the restoration meant a return to undisturbed quietude. While it was not overtly celebrated or specially adorned, it benefited immensely from the general restoration of respect for royal burials. The vault itself, having endured the neglect of the Commonwealth, was now once again under the protective wing of a monarch who understood the profound importance of tradition and lineage. Any minor damage or settling that had occurred during the previous decades might have been indirectly addressed through general chapel maintenance, ensuring the integrity of the surrounding structure. The renewed focus on ceremony and the visual grandeur of the monarchy under Charles II also meant that St. George's Chapel would once again host significant royal events, from garter ceremonies to state occasions. These events, though not directly involving Henry VIII's tomb, would bring a new influx of life and activity to the chapel, filling it with the sounds of courtly life, music, and the rustle of rich fabrics. The presence of the tomb beneath the choir would subtly add to the historical weight of these occasions, a silent reminder of the long line of kings and queens who had shaped England. One mainstream historical fact of the Restoration era, relevant to royal tombs, is the increasing professionalisation of historical record-keeping and a renewed interest in genealogy. With the monarchy firmly re-established, there was a greater emphasis on documenting royal lineage and ensuring proper historical accounts. While this didn't necessarily mean opening Henry's coffin, it solidified the knowledge of its location and contents within official records, ensuring its place in the documented history of the royal family. This formalised knowledge was a quiet yet significant act of preservation. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period involves the resurgence of an almost superstitious reverence for royal relics among some segments of the population. After the perceived godless years of the Commonwealth, there was a spiritual pendulum swing back towards tradition, and for some, This included a renewed belief in the sacred power of royal associations. While direct veneration of Henry VIII's tomb as a relic was unlikely, the general aura of sanctity around royal burial sites meant that his resting place, though unseen, was imbued with a certain mystical significance for the devout. It's a fascinating example of how popular belief could transform a mere physical location into something more profound. This brings us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Charles II's seemingly pragmatic approach to his father's burial, placing him in a shared vault rather than building a grand new tomb, was a conscious decision to avoid excessive expense after the turbulent period, a subtle nod to Puritan simplicity to prevent further backlash, or simply an acceptance of the existing arrangements as adequate. The relative lack of elaborate individual tombs for the Stuarts, compared to some of their predecessors, raises interesting questions about their priorities in royal commemoration. The environmental conditions within the vault itself would have remained remarkably consistent throughout this period. The lead lining of Henry's coffin, assuming it remained intact, would continue to create an anoxic, oxygen-depleted environment, significantly slowing decomposition. The coolness and darkness of the subterranean chamber provided ideal, albeit unintentional, conditions for long-term preservation of what was inside the heavy coffin. The subtle internal processes of decay would have continued, but at an incredibly slow pace, contained within their leaden shell. The return of the monarchy also meant a renewed focus on the physical well-being of the monarch, and by extension, the careful handling of royal bodies after death. The lessons of the Civil War and the indignities suffered by Charles I would have underscored the importance of ensuring a dignified passage for future kings and queens. While Henry was long gone, the broader context of royal funerary practices certainly benefited from the Restoration's emphasis on respect and order. The sounds within St. George's Chapel during the Restoration era would have included the rich harmonies of the reinstated choir, the powerful peal of the chapel bells, and the rustle of silks and velvets as courtiers and royal visitors once again graced its hallowed halls. These sounds, vibrant with renewed life and purpose, would have filtered down to the silent vault, a subtle reminder of the world continuing above. The presence of two such historically significant and ironically intertwined monarchs, Henry VIII and Charles I, in the same silent chamber created a unique historical resonance. It was a powerful, unseen monument to the dramatic twists and turns of English monarchical history. The care shown to St. George's Chapel during the Restoration, and the respectful acknowledgement of its royal dead, laid the groundwork for its enduring role as a royal mausoleum. Henry VIII's coffin, once a potential target of Republican zeal, now rested securely under the watchful eye of a restored monarchy, its silent presence a testament to the resilience of tradition. The Restoration reverenced the past, not by opening the tombs, but by ensuring their peaceful and undisturbed continuation. The king, though silent, was once again given his due, a silent anchor in a world that had once again righted itself after a period of profound disarray. As the Restoration era faded into the 18th century, the Georgian period dawned, bringing with it a new set of cultural sensibilities. The Age of Enlightenment emphasised reason, scientific inquiry, and a burgeoning interest in history for its own sake, rather than solely for dynastic legitimacy. For Henry VIII's coffin, still resting undisturbed in the vault beneath St. George's Chapel, this meant a shift in the collective gaze, less about immediate grief or political validation, and more about scholarly curiosity and historical inquiry. The Hanoverian monarchs, beginning with George I in 1714, were of German descent and at first less intimately connected to the deep-seated traditions of English royal burial than their predecessors. While they respected the customs of their adopted kingdom, their primary focus was on establishing their own legitimacy and consolidating power. St. George's Chapel remained a royal peculiar, a site of continuous worship and occasional royal ceremonies, but the specific visceral connection to the Tudor and early Stuart dead might have felt less immediate to the new dynasty. Nevertheless, the spirit of the age, driven by a growing intellectual curiosity, meant that Henry VIII, as a monumental figure in English history, continued to be a subject of fascination. His tumultuous reign, his break with Rome, and his 6 wives provided endless fodder for historians, poets, and playwrights. While the coffin itself remained sealed, The intellectual curiosity about its contents and the physical remains of such a pivotal figure slowly began to simmer. This was the era where antiquarianism evolved into a more systematic study of the past, paving the way for future archaeological and historical investigations. Within the chapel, the daily routine of services continued, but the 18th century saw a gradual shift in the aesthetics of church interiors. The elaborate, often highly ornate Baroque styles began to give way to more restrained classical forms. While St George's Chapel largely retained its Gothic splendour, minor alterations and maintenance would have continued. The sounds of worship, the grand organ, and the rustle of garments continued to fill the air, subtly filtered down to the dark, quiet vault below where the king lay. The persistent, cool atmosphere of the subterranean chamber provided a stable environment, ensuring the continued, slow-motion preservation of the contents within the lead-lined coffin. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates the Georgian era's approach to royal remains is the reburial of King George III and other members of his family within St George's Chapel itself, though in a newly constructed royal vault rather than in Henry VIII's specific location. This later development signified a continuation of the chapel's role as a royal mausoleum and underscores the ongoing architectural and ceremonial investment in royal burials during this period. The existence of Henry's vault and the knowledge of his specific wishes may have even informed the planning of these later royal interments, emphasising the importance of dedicated resting places for monarchs. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the Georgian period might involve the nascent tourism industry. As travel became slightly more accessible for the wealthier classes, and with the rise of guidebooks, St George's Chapel would have become a destination for those interested in history and royal spectacle. While visitors couldn't access Henry VIII's sealed vault, they would have walked directly over it, aware of the monumental figure lying beneath their feet. This created a peculiar, almost ghostly interaction, where the living literally trod upon the historical giants. One can imagine a particularly enthusiastic guide regaling a group with whispered tales of the old King Henry, perhaps adding a dramatic flourish about the sheer weight of his coffin. This brings us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the perceived lack of direct attention to Henry VIII's personal tomb during the Georgian era reflects a disinterest in his individual person, versus a broader focus on the institution of the monarchy, or if it was simply a matter of resource allocation and the priorities of a new dynasty. The Georgian kings were more concerned with stability and imperial expansion than with revisiting the controversial figures of the Tudor past, often preferring to focus on a more Xanatized version of history that emphasized continuity and a divinely ordained succession. The state of the coffin itself, undisturbed for over 2 centuries, would have undergone slow internal changes. The lead lining, while robust, was not entirely impervious to the passage of time. Minor shifts in the earth, the very slow processes of chemical change, and the gradual degradation of organic materials within the lead coffin would have continued. The embalming, effective for the immediate post-mortem period, would have allowed for significant internal decay over such an extended duration, even in an anoxic environment. However, the external integrity of the coffin, its heavy oak shell and lead casing, would have remained largely intact, protecting its contents from external elements. The atmosphere within the vault would have been one of profound stillness and darkness. The air, heavy and unmoving, would have settled into a constant cool temperature, conducive to the slow, almost glacial pace of decomposition. The sounds from above, the muffled organ music, the distant chiming of bells, the footsteps of the living, would have been mere whispers in the perpetual night of the vault, an auditory connection to the world beyond the stone. The Georgian era was also a period where the scientific method began to influence fields beyond just natural philosophy. There was a growing interest in empirical observation, and, by extension, a quiet, scholarly desire to verify historical accounts. While not yet leading to the opening of royal tombs, this intellectual current laid the groundwork for future generations who would indeed approach historical sites with a more forensic curiosity. The concept of evidence was gaining traction, and the physical remains of historical figures, though then unseen, were implicitly part of this burgeoning empirical understanding of the past. The enduring symbolism of St George's Chapel as a royal burial site remained undiminished, even for the Hanoverians. It was a tangible link to the long history of English monarchy, and Henry VIII, for all his controversy, was an undeniable cornerstone of that history. His tomb, therefore, contributed to the deep historical resonance of the chapel, making it more than just a place of worship, but a living museum of dynastic power and national identity. The presence of Charles III's coffin in the same vault with Henry VIII continued to be a fascinating, if unseen, historical juxtaposition. The executed monarch and the absolute monarch resting side by side, silent witnesses to the turbulent trajectory of English kingship. This unique companionship was a historical anomaly, a quiet irony that perhaps only a few very knowledgeable historians of the era would have fully appreciated. It added an extra layer of hidden depth to the seemingly quiescent vault. As the 18th century drew to a close and the tumultuous Napoleonic Wars raged across Europe, the world above Henry VIII's tomb was in constant flux. Yet, beneath the ground, the great king continued his silent repose, a steadfast, unchanging presence. The Georgian era's gaze, while distant and analytical, had nonetheless begun to pave the way for a more direct investigative curiosity about the physical remains of the past, a curiosity that would truly blossom in the century to come. The stage was being set for a potential rediscovery, a moment when the silence of the vault would finally be broken, and its secrets tentatively brought into the light. Having navigated the intellectual curiosity of the Georgian era, Henry VIII's coffin continued its long slumber within the vault of St. George's Chapel. Yet, even in the presumed stillness of a subterranean tomb, nothing remains entirely static. Over the centuries, the vault itself, a man-made chamber within the living earth, experienced subtle yet inexorable shifts, a testament to the ceaseless march of time and the slow, grinding processes of nature. These physical changes, though imperceptible from day to day, would subtly alter the environment around the king's final resting place. The vault, constructed in the 16th century, was a product of its time, sturdy but not necessarily engineered for millennia of geological stability. The very ground upon which Windsor Castle stands, while seemingly solid, is subject to the minute movements of the earth. Over 250 years, from Henry's burial in 1547 to the cusp of the 19th century, tiny seismic tremors, the slow shifting of underlying soil, and the relentless creep of groundwater would have exerted subtle pressures on the vault structure. These forces could lead to hairline cracks in the masonry, imperceptible settling of foundations, or even minor shifts in the alignment of stone blocks. The atmosphere within the vault, while generally stable, would also be subject to subtle changes. Despite efforts to seal it, some degree of moisture ingress would be inevitable over centuries. Condensation, rising damp from the surrounding earth, or even minute leakages from above could introduce humidity into the chamber. This moisture, combined with the perpetual darkness and cool temperatures, would create a unique microclimate. While the lead lining of Henry's coffin offered substantial protection, any breach or imperfection in its seal could expose the interior to this damp environment, accelerating degradation. The gradual accumulation of dust and debris would also contribute to the vault's changing landscape. Fine particles, carried by subtle air currents or filtering through minute cracks, would slowly settle on every surface, including the immense coffin. Over generations, this would form a thin, almost invisible layer, gradually obscuring the raw stone and giving the chamber an ancient, settled feel. It's a rather poetic thought. Dust, the great equalizer, settling even on the tomb of a mighty king. One of the more fascinating physical changes would be the natural decay of any organic materials that might have been left within the vault, but outside the lead coffin. Perhaps wooden supports used during the interment, forgotten tools, or even residual fabric from the burial ceremonies. These would slowly rot, crumble, or be consumed by fungi and insects, contributing to the earthy, musky scent of a long-sealed space. This ongoing biological activity, though hidden, represented the continuous quiet churn of nature, even in a man-made tomb. The presence of other coffins within the vault, particularly that of Charles I and later, possibly other royal family members or high-ranking nobles as originally intended, would also contribute to the physical environment. Each new interment would bring a brief period of activity, disturbance, and the introduction of new materials into the chamber. The arrangement of the coffins, the interplay of their weights, and the subtle interactions of their contained environments would all contribute to the vault's evolving internal dynamics. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the chapel's evolving relationship with its subterranean spaces is the establishment of a new, larger royal vault beneath the Albert Memorial Chapel in St. George's Chapel in the early 19th century. This decision, driven by a need for more royal burial space, implicitly acknowledged the limitations of the existing vaults, including Henry VIII's. It suggests that while Henry's resting place was respected, it was not deemed suitable for the burial needs of all future monarchs, indicating a practical, if subtle, shift in how these sacred spaces were managed over time. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this long period of unobserved decay is the persistent folklore surrounding the state of certain royal remains. Even without direct observation, whispers might have circulated about what truly remained of Henry VIII, whether the embalming had been truly successful, or if his massive frame had simply collapsed into dust. These informal forensic speculations, passed down through generations of chapel staff or local residents, would contribute to the mystique of the hidden tomb, adding an almost gossipy human element to the solemnity of royal death. This brings us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the slow, long-term degradation of the lead lining or other components of the coffin could have contributed to the peculiar smell reported by later investigators upon its discovery, or if that odour was solely attributable to the decomposition within. The interaction between the contents, the lead, and the external environment of the vault over centuries is a complex chemical and biological puzzle that remains a source of discussion. The silence within the vault, therefore, was not absolute or unchanging. It was a dynamic stillness, a slow-motion ballet of decay and preservation, where the elements worked their gradual magic. The sounds from above, the occasional footfall, the distant hum of worship, the maintenance of the chapel would filter down, perhaps muffled by accumulating earth and settling stones, but never entirely absent. These fleeting echoes of the living world would be the only auditory companions for the two kings resting in their shared, silent chamber. The sheer duration of this undisturbed period is remarkable. For over 2.5 centuries the vault remained largely sealed and unexamined. This extended period of quiet repose allowed the natural processes to unfold, creating a unique historical and environmental snapshot. The integrity of the chapel floor, meticulously restored after Henry's burial, ensured that the vault remained hidden, its secrets guarded by solid stone and centuries of accumulated dust. The subtle changes in the vault also relate to the broader understanding of conservation. While unintentional, the cool, dry environment, for much of the time, and the lead lining of the coffin acted as a remarkably effective, albeit crude, form of long-term preservation. Tudor embalmers, with their limited scientific knowledge, could not have fully predicted the long-term anoxic conditions that would develop within the sealed coffin, and which would play a crucial role in the partial preservation of its contents. It was a happy accident of technology and environment. The vault was not a vacuum. It was a living space, albeit one operating on a geological timescale. The constant, minute interplay between the man-made structure, the natural earth, and the organic contents within shaped its evolution. Each year, each decade, each century brought incremental changes, preparing the stage for a dramatic moment far in the future, a moment when the silence would finally be broken and the secrets of the vault revealed to a curious and scientifically minded age. The shifting sands of time, both literal and metaphorical, were patiently at work, preparing the way for discovery. The long undisturbed slumber of Henry VIII's coffin, stretching from the turmoil of the Commonwealth through the reasoned calm of the Georgian era, finally met its dramatic interruption in the early 19th century. This was an age propelled by burgeoning scientific inquiry, a renewed fascination with the past, and a practical need for space. It was during these bustling times that an unexpected discovery within St. George's Chapel brought the formidable Tudor king back into the light, quite literally. The catalyst for this unexpected encounter was not a deliberate archaeological expedition aimed at Henry VIII, but rather a more prosaic necessity, the need to create new royal burial space. The existing vaults, including the one housing Henry VIII and Charles I, were becoming full or were deemed unsuitable for the growing number of royal deceased. Consequently, during the reign of King George III, a new, larger royal vault was constructed directly beneath the Albert Memorial Chapel, adjacent to the existing burial areas within St. George's. This major architectural undertaking, begun in 1804 and completed in 1810, involved extensive excavation and construction within the ancient foundations of the chapel. It was during these extensive works, specifically in the process of creating access to the new vault and perhaps consolidating older foundations, that workmen accidentally broke into the vault containing Henry VIII and Charles I. The moment of discovery would have been one of profound surprise, followed quickly by awe. Imagine the scene, the rhythmic clang of picks and shovels, the shouts of workmen, suddenly replaced by a stunned silence as a pickaxe might strike something unexpected, something hollow and resonant. Then, the careful probing, the widening of the breach, and the first hesitant glimpse into the centuries-old darkness. The air that rushed out from the breached vault, after more than 250 years of being sealed, would have been thick and heavy, carrying a distinct, rather unpleasant odour, a mix of damp earth, stagnant air, and the unmistakable lingering scent of decomposition, however slow. It would have been a jarring, visceral experience for the first individuals to inhale it, a sudden sensory link to the long-dead occupants within. This initial olfactory assault was a stark reminder of the realities of human mortality, even for kings. Upon closer inspection, the scene within the vault would have slowly revealed itself. In the dim light, perhaps from lanterns lowered into the opening, two immense lead coffins would have been visible. One, undoubtedly larger and more ornate, belonged to Henry VIII. The other, likely simpler and bearing the marks of a more hasty interment, was that of Charles I. The sight of these two historically intertwined monarchs, resting side by side in eternal silence, must have been profoundly moving for those present, a powerful, unplanned tableau of English history. The accidental nature of the discovery meant that the initial examination was not a meticulous scientific undertaking, but rather a cautious, immediate inspection. The individuals present, likely master masons, chapel officials, and perhaps curious royal attendants, would have approached with a mix of reverence and morbid fascination. They would have noted the general condition of the coffins, the materials, and any visible inscriptions. The massive scale of Henry VIII's coffin would have been immediately apparent, a testament to his legendary girth even in death. One mainstream historical fact confirming this discovery is the detailed account given by Sir Henry Halford, the then surveyor of Windsor Castle. His records meticulously describe the accidental breach and the subsequent discovery of the coffins in the same vault, providing crucial contemporary evidence for this momentous event. Halford's report, though not a scientific study, provided the first official, modern-era glimpse into Henry VIII's final resting place, confirming its location and occupants. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the period surrounding this discovery involves the potential for local lore to instantly transform into popular anecdote. News of such a significant royal finding, even if officially contained, would undoubtedly spread like wildfire among the chapel staff, the residents of Windsor, and eventually the wider public. One can imagine hushed conversations in pubs and kitchens, with exaggerated tales of ghostly emanations or strange sounds from the opened vault, adding a layer of almost Gothic mystery to the tangible historical event. They say, someone might whisper over a pint, that you can still smell him, even now. This unexpected intrusion into the vault led to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the discovery of Charles III's coffin, in the same vault as Henry VIII, was a planned arrangement from the time of Charles's burial, perhaps a symbolic gesture by the parliamentarians, or if it was simply a matter of convenience due to the lack of other suitable royal burial spaces at the time of Charles's clandestine interment. The 19th century discovery provided definitive proof of their shared resting place, but the reasons for it remained a matter of historical interpretation. The initial examination of Henry VIII's coffin itself would have been limited. The exterior of the lead casing, likely discoloured and perhaps even slightly corroded after centuries in a damp, enclosed environment, would have been the primary focus. Any visible details, such as soldered seams or identifying marks, would have been noted. The immense weight of the coffin would have precluded any easy movement or extensive handling. It was a moment of observation, not of invasive study. The decision was quickly made not to disturb the coffins further, but to reseal the vault, albeit with a more robust and permanent barrier. The new royal vault was the immediate priority, and the accidental opening of Henry's tomb served as a fascinating sidebar, rather than a diversion from the main construction project. This suggests a blend of reverence and practicality, respect for the deceased monarchs, but also an understanding that their primary role now was historical, not ceremonial. The sealing of the vault after this initial glimpse would have been a more deliberate and careful process than the initial breach. New masonry would have been laid, perhaps reinforced, ensuring the long-term integrity of the chamber. The knowledge of its exact contents, now officially verified, would add a new layer of significance to that particular section of the chapel floor. Passers-by, knowing what lay beneath, might unconsciously tread a little more softly. The rediscovery of Henry VIII's coffin in 1813, though some accounts place it slightly earlier, marked a pivotal moment in its long history. For centuries, it had been a known but unseen entity, a historical fact recorded in old documents. Now it had been physically encountered, its existence confirmed, and its immediate environment briefly illuminated. This accidental encounter set the stage for later, more deliberate investigations, as the scientific and archaeological methods of the 19th century advanced. The curiosity sparked by this accidental discovery would linger. For those who witnessed it, or heard the first-hand accounts, the image of those two immense lead coffins in the dark vault would be indelible. It was a tangible link to a distant past, a moment when history was not just read from books, but felt, smelled, and glimpsed with one's own eyes. The silence of the vault had been broken, its secrets briefly aired, before being carefully sealed once more, awaiting the next inquisitive gaze. The 19th century, with its thirst for empirical knowledge, was just getting started with its historical investigations. The accidental breaching of Henry VIII's vault in the early 19th century, during the construction of the new royal vault at St. George's Chapel, had unveiled a tantalising glimpse into the long-sealed resting place of two pivotal monarchs. This initial unscheduled peek, however, was merely an appetizer for the burgeoning scientific and historical curiosity of the Victorian era. The 19th century was a time of grand archaeological digs, systematic historical inquiry, and an insatiable desire to understand the material past. For the coffin of Henry VIII, this meant that the period of quiet, accidental discovery would give way to more deliberate and documented investigations. The official confirmation of the vault's contents, particularly the presence of Charles I's coffin alongside Henry VIII, sparked considerable public and scholarly interest. While the initial breach had been resealed, the knowledge of what lay beneath the chapel floor was now widespread amongst historians, antiquaries, and even the general public with an interest in royal history. This intellectual momentum, coupled with the increasingly sophisticated methods of historical research, inevitably led to calls for a more thorough, albeit respectful examination. It was in 1888, under the reign of Queen Victoria, that a more formal and meticulous investigation of the vault was undertaken. This was not another accidental discovery, but a planned scholarly endeavour, indicative of the Victorian age's commitment to historical preservation and scientific inquiry. The royal family, ever conscious of their lineage and the dignity of their ancestors, would have granted permission, understanding the historical significance of such an undertaking. The purpose was clear: to officially identify and document the remains, ensuring their proper and dignified repose. Imagine the scene: the chapel floor, at the designated spot in the choir, being carefully disassembled. The removal of the paving stones, which had sealed the vault for centuries, would have been a delicate operation, undertaken by skilled masons under the watchful eyes of prominent historians, royal officials, and perhaps even a physician or two. As the heavy stone slab covering the vault was once again lifted, the same heavy, distinctive odour that had greeted the workmen earlier in the century would have wafted out, a powerful, albeit unpleasant, greeting from the past. Gas lights, or perhaps early electric lights, would have illuminated the dark chamber, revealing its contents with a clarity impossible in earlier, lantern-lit glimpses. The two immense lead coffins, that of Henry VIII and Charles I, would have been immediately identifiable, perhaps now with a visible layer of accumulated dust and subtle signs of their long interment. The lead, though remarkably durable, might have shown minor signs of oxidation or slight bulging due to internal pressures over centuries. The focus of the 1888 investigation was primarily on verification and documentation, while the temptation to open Henry VIII's coffin entirely must have been immense for the curious minds present. It was resisted. The primary objective was to confirm identities and record the external condition of the coffins, respecting the sanctity of the royal dead. However, a small aperture, perhaps a crack in the lead, or a seam that had slightly separated, may have offered a limited glimpse or allowed for certain observations without fully breaching the main seal. This is where the accounts become particularly intriguing, offering tantalising hints of what lay within. One mainstream historical fact from the 1888 investigation is the detailed report compiled by the then Dean of Windsor, Gerald Wellesley. His account meticulously records the observations made, confirming the identification of both Henry VIII and Charles I's coffins. Crucially, the report noted the immense size of Henry VIII's coffin, affirming his legendary bulk even in death. This official documentation provided invaluable primary source material for future historians. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this investigation involves the description of the peculiar smell emanating from the vault. Witnesses often described it as disagreeable, musty, or even sweetish, a characteristic odour associated with the breakdown of organic matter in an anoxic environment. This detail, though seemingly minor, offers a fascinating sensory link to the past, reminding us that historical encounters are not always purely visual or intellectual. It's the kind of detail that makes you wrinkle your nose even centuries later. This renewed examination also brought to light an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the observations made in 1888, particularly regarding the state of Henry VIII's coffin, and any perceived slight disarray, suggest that his coffin might have been partially opened or disturbed at some point before the 1813 accidental discovery, perhaps during the tumultuous Commonwealth period, or if the slight dislodgement was merely due to natural settling over centuries. The subtle ambiguities in the historical record allow for continued discussion on the precise chain of events within the vault. The sheer reverence for the deceased monarchs, even those as controversial as Henry VIII, guided the Victorian investigators. Their approach was one of meticulous caution, balancing scientific curiosity with profound respect for the royal dead. Tools were likely to be handled with extreme care and measurements taken with precision. The environment of the vault would have been chilly, damp, and the air heavy, yet the sense of profound historical significance would have overshadowed any discomfort. The presence of the coffin of Charles I in the same vault continued to be a source of immense historical fascination. The regicide king and the king who founded the English Church resting in unexpected proximity. The 1888 investigation served to officially confirm this unusual arrangement, solidifying its place in the historical narrative of the chapel. It's a powerful, almost allegorical image of the dramatic turns of English history, confined within a small dark chamber. So, we meet again, eh, Charles? One might imagine Henry's spirit grumbling. Didn't think you'd be joining me quite so soon, nor in such a humble abode. The findings from the 1888 investigation, though limited to external observations, confirmed the robust construction of Henry VIII's coffin. Its lead lining, designed to contain the king's massive embalmed body, had largely fulfilled its purpose, albeit with the inevitable processes of decay occurring within. The heavy oak shell had protected the lead, ensuring the long-term integrity of the container. The details gathered provided crucial information about Tudor burial practices and the remarkable longevity of the materials used. Once the observations and documentation were complete, the vault was carefully resealed. The paving stones were returned to their places, and the chapel floor was restored, perhaps with an even greater sense of its hidden historical treasures. The 1888 investigation marked a significant moment. The tomb of Henry VIII had been formally acknowledged, briefly illuminated, and its contents officially verified for the Victorian age. It was a methodical inquiry, driven by a deep respect for history and a burgeoning scientific method. While the coffin itself was not opened, the stage was now firmly set for a future, even more detailed, exploration of its inner secrets. For the curiosity of mankind is a relentless force, always pushing the boundaries of what is known. The methodical Victorian investigations of 1888, which had respectfully probed the outer confines of Henry VIII's burial vault, left a lingering question. What, precisely, lay inside that immense lead-lined coffin? While the external observations had confirmed the king's immense size and the surprising proximity of Charles III, the tantalising mystery of his actual remains, after centuries of embalming and decay, persisted. This profound curiosity, coupled with advancements in forensic understanding, meant that the secrets of the coffin's interior would eventually carefully be revealed. While the 1888 examination had been thorough in its external documentation, the definitive moment of peering inside the coffin came earlier, with the 1813, or 1813 to 1817 depending on the account's specificity, accidental discovery and the subsequent, albeit brief, opening. It was during this initial breach, when the workmen stumbled upon the vault, that the opportunity arose for a limited, almost furtive inspection of Henry VIII's actual contents. This was not a formal archaeological dig, but a pragmatic moment of necessity and unexpected revelation. The accounts from this period, particularly Sir Henry Halford's report, offer the most direct glimpse into the coffin's interior. Halford, a physician and royal physician, was present during parts of the initial discovery and was among those who witnessed the internal state of the coffins. His observations, though brief and non-invasive by modern standards, provide a compelling, if somewhat macabre, picture. As the lid of Henry VIII's lead coffin was, by some accounts, found to be slightly dislodged or capable of being nudged open just enough for a view, the first striking revelation was the sheer volume of space within. The king's body, despite his colossal size in life, had undergone significant post-mortem changes. Halford reported that the coffin contained the remains of a very large person, suggesting that even in decay, the king's imposing stature was evident. However, what was observed was not a well-preserved body, but rather a collapsed and decayed form. The embalming, while effective in delaying the initial stages of putrefaction and containing fluids, could not ultimately defy the long march of decomposition over centuries. The interior of the lead coffin, described by witnesses, was filled with a thick, viscous fluid. This was the result of the body's gradual decomposition within the sealed, anoxic, oxygen-deprived environment created by the lead casing. In such conditions, the normal processes of aerobic decay, which lead to desiccation and skeletonization, are inhibited. Instead, the body undergoes a process called saponification, where body fats transform into a waxy, soap-like substance known as a dipucher. This substance can help preserve soft tissues, but it results in a rather unpleasant semi-liquid mass. The reports indicate a large amount of this dark fluid, confirming the extent of this specific type of decomposition. This is where the peculiar, almost sweetish and certainly disagreeable odour would have originated, a potent mix of decaying organic matter and the products of anaerobic breakdown. Halford's account specifically noted a dark fluid in which the bones lay. This is a crucial observation, indicating that while some soft tissue may have been converted to adipocere, the skeletal structure remained. The bones themselves, remarkably durable, would have largely resisted decomposition, although they might have been discoloured or softened by the long immersion in the putrefactive fluid. The fact that distinct bones were visible suggests that the anatomical integrity, while collapsed, was still discernible. One can almost hear the hushed gasps of the onlookers, their scientific curiosity momentarily overshadowed by the stark reality of seeing the remnants of such a titan of history. Well, he certainly won't be needing his doublet anymore, a sardonic observer might muse. The condition of the materials inside the coffin also provided clues about Tudor embalming. The spices and aromatic substances that would have been packed around the body would have long since lost their fragrance, likely dissolving into the fluid. Any fabrics or internal linings would have deteriorated significantly, becoming saturated and disintegrating into a sludge. The lead lining, however, had performed its critical function, preventing external air and moisture from entering and keeping the putrefactive processes contained. This containment was paramount for the long-term preservation of the chapel's atmosphere, and indeed for the dignified image of the royal burial. A mainstream historical fact stemming directly from these internal observations is the confirmation of the effectiveness and limitations of Tudor embalming techniques over extended periods. While not a full mummification, the lead containment and specific chemical environment created did significantly alter the decomposition process, leading to the formation of adipocere and the preservation of skeletal remains, rather than complete disintegration. This forensic insight is invaluable for understanding historical burial practices. A quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the sheer mental fortitude required by those early 19th century investigators. To peer into a coffin containing the liquefying remains of a monumental historical figure, releasing a centuries-old pungent odour without modern protective equipment, speaks volumes about their dedication to historical inquiry. One imagines them steeling themselves, perhaps with a dash of brandy, before each inspection, knowing they were about to confront history in its rawest, most visceral form. This brings us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the initial description of a dark fluid and visible bones in Henry VIII's coffin implies a rapid, complete liquefaction of soft tissues, or if a significant amount of adipocere, which has a waxy, sometimes semi-solid consistency, was also present but simply described broadly as fluid. The precise state of preservation and the exact composition of the organic remains within the coffin continue to be a subject of subtle, nuanced discussion among those who study historical decomposition. The presence of Charles I's coffin in the same vault also offered a comparative, if brief, observation. Halford's report also details a glimpse into Charles I's coffin, noting that his remains were remarkably better preserved, even to the point of being able to discern his facial features and beard, likely due to a more sophisticated embalming, or perhaps different environmental factors within his immediate burial shroud. This stark contrast between the two coffins underscores the variability of historical preservation and adds another layer of intrigue to their shared resting place. The brief internal examination of Henry VIII's coffin in the early 19th century was a pivotal moment. It transformed the abstract historical fact of his burial into a tangible, if somewhat grisly, reality. It confirmed that the king was indeed there, his colossal frame still evident, albeit reduced to bones immersed in the dark remnants of decay. This first-hand, though fleeting glimpse provided invaluable evidence about his final physical state and the processes that had unfolded over centuries in the silent darkness of his tomb. Following these observations, the coffins were carefully left in their positions, and the vault was sealed once more. The details recorded, however, provided a solid foundation for future historical understanding, preventing further invasive inquiries while still satisfying the burgeoning intellectual appetite for empirical knowledge. The contents of the coffin, once the domain of whispers and speculation, were now officially, if briefly, documented. Henry VIII, the king who famously controlled every aspect of his life, even in death, had finally, involuntarily, yielded a few of his ultimate secrets to the curious gaze of a new scientific age. His coffin, a silent time capsule, had briefly opened a window to a distant, decaying past. The revelations from the 1813, and later, 1888, inspections of Henry VIII's vault, particularly the brief glimpse into his lead-lined coffin, laid the groundwork for a new era of scholarly inquiry. While the physical remains were once again sealed away, the detailed, if limited, observations sparked enduring questions and fueled modern historical speculation about the king's health, his physical state at death, and the efficacy of Tudor embalming. The coffin, though unseen, became a powerful focal point for continuing academic debate. One of the primary areas of modern speculation revolves around Henry VIII's health in his final years. Contemporary accounts, often from foreign ambassadors or courtiers, described a king bloated, incapacitated by a painful leg ulcer, and increasingly irascible. The discovery of his exceptionally large coffin and the subsequent confirmation of a very large person within, even in decay, reinforces the historical narrative of his extreme obesity. Historians now combine these accounts with the physical evidence to paint a more complete picture of a man whose body was failing him, likely contributing to his tyrannical moods and erratic behaviour. The sheer challenge of moving and containing such a massive body also lends credence to these historical descriptions. The nature of the dark fluid and skeletal remains found within the coffin continues to be a point of fascinating modern forensic analysis, even without direct access to the contents. The concept of adipocere formation, where body fats saponify in an anoxic environment, is well understood by forensic scientists today. The observations made by Halford in the early 19th century are consistent with a body that underwent this process rather than full desiccation. Modern scholars can interpret these centuries-old descriptions through the lens of current scientific knowledge, providing insights into the specific conditions within the sealed lead coffin. This understanding allows for educated guesses about the chemical reactions that transpired over 250 years in that dark, undisturbed space. Another significant area of modern inquiry concerns the precise cause of Henry VIII's death. While contemporary chroniclers usually attributed it to natural causes, often vague ailments, modern historians and medical experts have proposed various theories based on his symptoms. These include chronic leg ulcers that led to sepsis, uncontrolled diabetes, Cushing's syndrome due to an adrenal tumour, or even tertiary syphilis. The sealed nature of the coffin prevents definitive answers, but the knowledge of his physical state at death, reinforced by the size of his coffin, lends weight to theories involving metabolic or circulatory disorders. It's a medical detective story, with only circumstantial evidence from centuries past. The unexpected co-occupancy of the vault with Charles I also continues to intrigue modern scholars. Historians still argue whether the decision to bury Charles I alongside Henry VIII was a deliberate act of contempt by the parliamentarians, aiming to diminish the royal dignity by placing the executed monarch in a shared, rather than grand, tomb, or if it was simply a pragmatic choice due to the turbulent times and the immediate need for a secure, available burial space. The juxtaposition of the absolute monarch and the martyred monarch creates a powerful historical irony that continues to be a subject of academic contemplation. It's almost a historical punchline, a dark jest from the fates. The very choice of Windsor as Henry's final resting place, rather than a more prominent London location, also fuels modern speculation. While he had planned a grander tomb at Windsor, the ultimate simplicity of his burial in the existing vault, rather than a new, stand-alone monument, raises questions. Historians still argue whether this reflects a last-minute change of heart, a desire for a more humble resting place, or simply a practical consequence of his declining health and the urgent need to secure the succession. The lack of a towering, dedicated monument like those of some other monarchs leaves room for fascinating interpretation of Henry's final wishes. Modern imaging technologies, while not yet applied to Henry VIII's coffin, due to its protected status and the desire for non-invasive approaches, present a tantalizing future possibility. Techniques like ground-penetrating radar or advanced medical imaging could, theoretically, offer a more detailed, non-destructive view of the coffin's interior, potentially revealing more about the skeletal remains and the state of preservation without opening the lead seal. This prospect continues to be discussed in conservation and historical circles, balancing the desire for knowledge with the imperative of preserving historical integrity. The enduring interest in Henry VIII's coffin is also a testament to his monumental legacy. He was a king who irrevocably changed England, and his physical remains, however decayed, remain a tangible link to that transformative period. Modern scholars continue to delve into archival records, examining contemporary accounts of his death, funeral, and subsequent historical interpretations, all of which are enriched by the knowledge of what lies beneath St. George's Chapel. It's a continuous, evolving dialogue between the living and the long dead. A quirky or fringe tidbit of modern speculation concerns the possibility of hidden artefacts or personal effects within Henry's coffin. While contemporary accounts suggest a relatively straightforward embalming and dressing, the allure of finding some small personal item, a ring, a religious medal, nestled amongst the remains is a persistent, if unlikely, fantasy. Such a discovery would provide an incredibly intimate connection to the larger-than-life monarch, offering a rare glimpse beyond his public persona. The careful resealing of the vault after the 19th century inspections and its continued protection highlights the modern historical community's commitment to non-invasive preservation. While curiosity is high, the understanding that these are irreplaceable historical artifacts and the remains of a sovereign outweighs the desire for full forensic analysis. The decision to keep the coffin sealed reflects a balance between scientific inquiry and respectful custodianship of the past. It's a delicate dance between knowledge and reverence. The sounds within St. George's Chapel today remain much as they have for centuries. The hushed reverence of visitors, the soft echo of footsteps, the daily services, and the occasional grandeur of a royal ceremony. These sounds continue to filter down to the silent vault, a gentle reminder that life continues above, even as history sleeps below. The presence of the king, unseen but undeniably there, lends a unique gravitas to the chapel, a powerful sense of connection to a distant, yet profoundly influential past. Modern scholarly debates often circle back to the broader impact of Henry VIII on English identity. His tomb, as a physical embodiment of his legacy, becomes a silent participant in these discussions. It represents the seismic shifts he initiated, the break with Rome, the rise of English nationalism, the establishment of the Anglican Church, all stemming from the decisions of the man now confined to that lead-lined box. The coffin is not just a container, it's a symbol, a potent reminder of a reign that continues to define a nation. The current theories and lingering questions ensure that Henry VIII, even in death, remains a vibrant subject of historical fascination, his secrets carefully guarded but endlessly pondered. Having explored the solemn journey, the meticulous preparations, and the eventual accidental unveilings of Henry VIII's coffin, we arrive at its enduring legacy. The colossal lead-lined box resting in the quiet darkness of St. George's Chapel is far more than just a container for a deceased monarch. It is a powerful, silent monument to a reign that irrevocably shaped England, a tangible link to a pivotal moment in history that continues to reverberate through the centuries. Henry VIII, despite being entombed, remains a vibrant, often debated figure, and his final resting place holds a unique resonance. The very fact that his coffin has survived for nearly 5 centuries, resisting the depredations of time, war, and the curious gaze of generations, speaks volumes. It stands as a testament to the robust craftsmanship of the Tudor era, and, perhaps inadvertently, to the remarkable preservative qualities of a well-sealed lead container. In an age where much of the past has crumbled to dust, the physical presence of Henry VIII's burial site offers a unique anchor to a distant age, a solid counterpoint to the fluidity of historical interpretation. Henry VIII's impact on England is immeasurable, and his coffin serves as a powerful symbol of that legacy. His break with Rome, fueled by his desire for a male heir and an almost obsessive need for control, fundamentally reshaped the religious landscape of the nation. The establishment of the Church of England, rooted in his actions, continues to be a defining characteristic of English identity. His tomb, lying beneath the very chapel that became a cornerstone of the Anglican faith, quietly reminds us of this monumental transformation. It is a silent witness to a schism that redefined a nation's spiritual and political allegiance. Beyond religion, Henry's reign dramatically altered the balance of power between the crown and other institutions, particularly the nobility and parliament. He centralised authority, expanded royal prerogative, and initiated changes that would lay the groundwork for a more powerful, consolidated English state. His immense personal power, his capacity for both great patronage and terrifying brutality, are all encapsulated in the knowledge of his massive frame confined to that imposing coffin. He literally filled the space, just as he filled the political landscape of his era. The continuing fascination with Henry VIII, across popular culture, academia, and even tourism, ensures that his coffin retains its enduring allure. From academic conferences debating his motives to historical dramas depicting his wives and ministers, Henry remains a compelling, controversial character. His tomb, though inaccessible to the public, is the ultimate physical manifestation of his historical reality, a grounding point for all the narratives woven around him. It is the ultimate "he was here" marker for one of history's most compelling figures. One can almost imagine the ghost of a modern history student, perhaps after a particularly trying exam on the Tudors, muttering, "Finally, he's staying put for once." The presence of Charles I's coffin in the same vault adds another layer of profound historical irony and significance. The two kings, so different in their approaches to power and so tragically linked by their fates, one an absolute monarch who forged a new church, the other executed by a parliament he defied, lie side by side in eternal silence. This unique cohabitation serves as a poignant reminder of the unpredictable currents of English history, a silent dialogue between two iconic figures who represent contrasting phases of royal authority and national upheaval. It's a historical odd couple, eternally sharing their final intimate space. The careful preservation of the vault and its contents in modern times reflects a shift in historical methodology towards non-invasive study and a deeper appreciation for the integrity of historical sites. While the curiosity to fully exhume and forensically analyse Henry VIII's remains is undoubtedly strong among some scholars, the prevailing sentiment prioritises the dignity of the royal dead and the preservation of the tomb as an untouched historical artefact. This balance between scientific inquiry and respectful custodianship is a hallmark of contemporary historical practice. The very construction of the coffin, its lead lining, and the embalming techniques of the Tudor era continue to provide valuable insights for those studying historical burial practices and early forensic science. The observations made centuries ago, detailing the dark fluid and the presence of bones, contribute to our understanding of decomposition in anoxic environments and the limitations of 16th century preservation methods. The coffin itself is a kind of historical experiment, yielding its data slowly over time. The Chapel of St. George at Windsor, already steeped in centuries of royal history, finds its mystique profoundly deepened by the knowledge of Henry VIII's presence. It is a place where the living walk directly above the dead, where the echoes of contemporary worship mingle with the silent, weighty presence of past monarchs. The tomb is not just a point on a map. It is a vital part of the chapel's sacred geography, influencing the atmosphere and the visitor's experience, even if they never see its hidden depths. Historians still argue whether Henry VIII truly achieved the eternal peace he sought in death, given the tumultuous nature of his life and the ongoing debate surrounding his legacy. His coffin, rather than marking a definitive end, instead serves as a perpetual starting point for discussions about power, succession, religion, and the very identity of England. The questions he posed and the answers he violently imposed continue to shape academic inquiry and public imagination. The coffin doesn't offer answers, it offers a place for continued questioning. The legacy of Henry VIII is not static, it is a living, evolving narrative. His coffin, nestled in its vault, is a silent anchor in this narrative, a tangible point of reference for all the complex layers of history that have unfolded since his passing. It reminds us that even the most formidable figures eventually return to dust, yet their impact, their ideas, and their very physical presence continue to resonate across the ages. The sheer weight of history, both literal and metaphorical, rests in that quiet chamber. The subtle sounds of the chapel today, the creak of the ancient timbers, the murmur of guided tours, the occasional burst of organ music, all filter down to the vault, a constant, gentle hum of the world continuing above. Below, in the absolute darkness, the great king sleeps, his secrets largely untold, his presence undiminished. His coffin, a silent sentinel of history, ensures that the memory of Henry VIII, in all his grandeur and complexity, will continue to echo through the corridors of time. And so, as the final echoes of our journey into history begin to fade, allow your mind to drift from the solemn chambers and ancient stones. The story of Henry VIII's coffin, a tale of power and decay, of solemn ceremony and quiet mystery, now recedes into the soft embrace of the night. Remember the stillness of the vault, the long passage of time, and how even the most imposing figures eventually find their enduring peace, or perhaps their eternal rest. Let the images soften, the details blur, and the whispers of history merge with the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. Drift now from the grandeur and the gravity into the calming quietude